If you read, you'd fucking know that, because you would look at what the most educated people of 500 years ago believed, and it was all wrong.
Yep.
and
it would be arrogant to think that we're not making the same mistake now.
Exactly.
And so the way I always say is, like, one of my favorite maxes is actions express priority. Like, I don't care what people say, I care what they do.
What's great about it is, like, it shows you that America before all of the rules and the Fed and all of that kind of moved in. It was like, you want to do something? The guy who did Rushmore, he didn't ask for anyone's permission. Yep. He didn't ask for anyone's funding.
Like, you read this life story, go back and read the Wikipedia page for somebody in like the early 1900s, late 1800s. It's like, how did one person do all of these things? If you have like an Apple or a Ferrari or a Rolls Royce or an Estee Lauder company, behind all these brands that last for generations and decade after decade is like, you can inevitably trace it back to one obsessed psychotic founder, right? I think founders rightly do this as well. Like John D. Rockefeller, when he came across somebody smart, he hired him, even if he didn't have anything to do. He's like, I don't care.
The line that you are really getting through with is, we are deterministic thinkers living in a probabilistic world. Hilarity or tragedy often ensue. And he goes, there's no Elon Musks, there's no Steve Jobs, there's no Bezos, there's none of these people, because everybody is calibrated. There's no progress, right? And then you start thinking about previous societies, man, and there was no progress.
He described life as, he says, life is a magnificent, mysterious odyssey to be experienced. And I think the people that you're describing, where they're like scared of taking risks, or like they want to live in like this little like routine or bubble, like they're missing out on a huge part. It's like, it's an odyssey, it's an experience, and there's going to be great times and terrible times.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everybody. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another edition of Infinite Loops, and I cannot tell you how excited I am to have my now good friend. We talked for like an hour before even starting the recording, David Senra of, where did you hear him? Gosh, I wonder. I think you went absolutely fucking viral on my very own son's podcast, Invest Like the Best, but with your podcast, which you now are part of Colossus, you provide a service that people prior to the internet simply couldn't enjoy. In other words, it's like, let's put this back in 1920, guys. What would you pay for a genius, obsessive lunatic to read every book about every great entrepreneur and then synthesize that knowledge for you, give you all of the high points of that knowledge for you, give you things that you can learn to make your own journey a little bit easier? What would you pay? I don't know. I'd have paid a ton of money. And now, because of the internet, we have David doing it for free, now as a member of the Colossus Network. David, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
One thing that's just killing me is like you're a member of the Colossus Network, but I'm not. Infinite Loops isn't, and like
I could put in a good word for you if you want.
Yeah, no, he's got me. Yeah, he's already blocked my number on his phone, so it's like it's almost impossible. Listen, all joking aside, I don't listen to podcasts through very often. Honestly, I read most of the transcripts, but I love the ability to, as we were talking about earlier, when I can't be reading or whatever, I like to listen. And so I was in one of those things in transit somewhere, and I thought, oh, Patrick's always really good about texting me and saying, hey, Dad, you really have to listen to this particular podcast. You're going to love David. And so I listened. You fucking blew me away with, I honestly, and again, I really mean this, the wisdom to minute ratio on your podcast is probably the densest I've ever seen, because I listened to it again right after listening to it the first time. And then I read the transcripts. Dude, you are amazing.
I appreciate that.
So I want to start out with you, as opposed to, we have so many interesting, fascinating people we're going to talk about and some of the lessons that they give us. I'm a huge reader like you. I've read a lot of the books. I saw your list and I'm like, hey, this is a really good list. But I want to hear about you, David, because you have a really interesting story. And when we were chatting earlier, I'd also kind of like to highlight the point that you made about the people who love the rule of law, freedom of speech, et cetera, the wonderful Bill of Rights in this wonderful country of the United States of America are sadly, well, I shouldn't say sadly, I'm glad that they're here, but they're people who escaped tyranny and now really value freedom. And I know your grandfather's story is this. So if you wouldn't mind, it's a really fascinating story.
So we were talking right before we started recording that I just finished reading the autobiography of Sam Zell, who's obviously extremely famous and has like this cult-like following. And one of the things that blew me away was the fact that his dad saw the rise of Hitler coming, and he was on the last train out of Poland that before Hitler bombed the train tracks. He gets out, he goes to his parents and begs, please come with me, please come with me. He's got a wife and a baby girl. Sam is not born yet, and his family refuses. They wind up taking this like 2-year odyssey to get to America, and his parents die. Their siblings die. They lose, I think, 18 little kids of the family are murdered. And so once they get to America, what was fascinating is Sam's born, and they preach like the opportunities that Sam has in this country that was just not possible where they came from. And so what they would do is they would celebrate the day of their arrival in America. It's almost like you would celebrate a birthday for the rest of their lives until they died. I think his dad died in like 1986. And so I'm reading the book, and I just made the podcast on it. And as I'm reading the book, I just, the way my process is, I just, whatever sticks out to me. Like, I don't try to overthink. It's like, oh, that's interesting, or that evokes some kind of emotion. So I'll highlight it, and then I'll jot down in the book on a Post-it note, like, what's the first thing that came to my mind? And what came to my mind is that there's nobody that loves America like a refugee from a totalitarian like regime. And so I knew that because I grew up with stories. I grew up in South Florida, Miami. My dad was born in Cuba. And my grandfather, who was not an educated man by any means, he worked as a butcher, and he worked in like a factory that made, I think, socks or shoes. I can't remember exactly. And he saw what was happening in 1959 when he finally leaves. And so he takes the risk. He's like, okay, I'm married. He's in his late 30s. He's married. He's got a baby son, which is my father, right? He does not speak English, does not have an education, and very little money. And he took the risk, just like Sam Zell's father said, hey, I got to get the hell out of here. And so he winds up coming to America. And I wound up as a byproduct of having the podcast too, is like, I get to meet a ton of smart founders. So like I'm so like happy that I just like stumbled upon like what I'm doing for a craft, in the sense like half my day is spent having one-sided conversations with the history's greatest entrepreneurs. And I do that in the form of a biography and autobiography. And then the other half is like meeting all these interesting, smart people like yourself through the podcast. So I just had a 4-hour dinner with these 2 Cuban twins that are they live in Miami. They're founders of this company called Lula. And I think they're like 25 or 26. And they talked about this because they're the son of Cuban immigrants. They grew up on a farm in Kendall. And like, same thing. Their parents didn't have a lot of money, no education, but they got them to this country. And now the country, they just raised, $20 million from all these other people. And like, they're trying to build this gigantic company. And we immediately connected because it's like, all these other people that go around. You don't understand that unless you were raised like every single Cubans have this thing called Noche Buena, which is like they celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve. And so what they would do is in the Cuban community in South Florida is usually you were having wave after wave of people that came over on rafts. Like that's what I spent my childhood, like meeting people that it was so their circumstances back in their home country where they're born, where their entire family was so bad that they got on a handmade raft. I mean, you're talking about like, so in some cases I've heard stories of people getting over on like truck tires, like giant, like bulldozer tires. So you hear these stories and then like they come and what do? Is like they risk the lives of their of their parents, of their kids in some cases. They go to the edge of the coast in Cuba and say, hey, let's go out and try and hope that we're just going to go in the direction and actually land in America. And I just read this book called The Sugar King of Havana. It's called it's a biography of the last sugar tycoon, right when Castro took over, this guy named Julio Lobo. And while I was reading that book to make a podcast on a few months ago, I was like, I got to figure out like how many people, because it talks about how many people die doing that. And that's not like you have reliable data, right? They're not saying, hey, Castro, I'm going to the edge. Like, I'll let you know when I get there. They're sneaking out, and a lot of them were never seen again. And so there's this project in the University of Miami, and they estimate it to be hundreds of thousands of people that perished in that 90 miles between Key West and Havana. And so the way I always say is like, one of my favorite maxes is actions express priority. Like, I don't care what people say, I care what they do. And when you have this debate on like, of course, every country's imperfect. Humans are imperfect, right? I go, but like, it's not about what we say, it's about what we do. It's like, how many Americans have gone to the coast of Miami on South Beach or Key West and said, hey, kids, let's build a raft and I hope you make it to Cuba. That thing happens in one direction only. That tells you everything you need to know about it.
Totally agree. We were talking earlier about a book that the book itself is really not that great, but the thesis is really interesting. It's called The Hypomanic Edge, Why America is like what it is. And essentially the thesis of the author is exactly what you just described. Basically, what was America made up of until the first anti-immigration sentiment started in the early teens with all the anarchist bombings? Like, America became fiercely anti-immigrant, but before then, we'd basically been open borders. And who came? Well, the people who came are people who were willing to say, hey, my home country, where my family has been for 5 centuries, fuck you. Neighbors, goodbye. Cousins, see ya. Oh, you don't have any money. Yeah, no, I'm going with the suit I'm wearing and I'm going to see what happens. Okay. Yeah. What kind of person is that, right? That's a self-selected risk taker. That's a purchaser of risk, right? As opposed to a seller of risk. And so the thesis of the book is, well, guess what? They all married each other, started having kids, and the kids all married each other. And because of the sample size, right, we had the population from the entire world. So basically, we were creating a bunch of risk-seeking mutts who had an environment where they were like, there's a great book by, what's his name, Brian, I'm losing it right now. It's called America Bill Bryson. And it's America, A Summer, 1927. If you haven't read it yet, man, read it.
I haven't.
Because like, he does such a great job as a storyteller, telling you like what things were like, but in such a fantastic narrative that you just can't wait. It's like I knew all about Charles Lindbergh. I thought I knew fuck all about Charles Lindbergh. And like, when you hear like the intensity of his fame, we've never seen anything like it. Like, no, literally
concentrated back then.
Exactly. Yep. But what's great about it is like, it shows you that America before all of the rules and the Fed and all of that kind of moved in. It was like, you want to do something? Yeah, go ahead. Like the guy who did Rushmore, he didn't ask for anyone's permission. He didn't ask for anyone's funding. And Coleridge loved to fish. And so he went to what was president, Silent Cal, right? Anyway, so Cal didn't know that his aides always stocked the lake in which he fished. So he couldn't imagine why, like, I always get lucky here. I just can't imagine why. And so somebody comes up to him and says, Mr. President, there's this guy who's like doing a sculpture on Mount Rushmore of like all the presidents. And Coleridge is like, well, I got to see this. So he gets on a fucking mule or whatever and makes the arduous trip up, because at that time there are no roads, no anything. And he's looking at it. The guy comes down, Mr. President, very nice. Yeah, interesting work. Why'd you decide to do that? Yeah, because I wanted to. I felt I had to. I love this country and I love these presidents. But the whole thing is just such a wonderful, if you got an idea, give it a try. And like the prohibitions, the red tape that we've grown accustomed to as a country just literally didn't exist. And you'll love it because like things I never knew, Herbert Hoover, right? The reason he got elected president was because of his handling of some crises in the weather in the middle of the country. He was like, we should probably do something about this to the federal government. They're like, not our problem.
I picked up a 600-page biography of Herbert Hoover. I was visiting family in Austin, Texas, and they have these gigantic used bookstores. So every time I travel, I go to a used bookstore. And now I had to bring another bag because I literally have like my suitcase, and then I come back with a bag of books. And what blew my mind is, in fact, I bought 5 books on presidents I'm eventually going to turn into podcasts for founders. But what Herbert Hoover, I didn't know, is like, now that he made like $100 million in like Chinese mining or something before he was president, he wound up evacuating a bunch of people from, I have to read the book. So I only got like reading overview of his life, but he wound up being really successful, like evacuating a bunch of American, I think, refugees from England before World War II. Like it was just, or World War I maybe. It was just incredible. In fact, I had a friend of mine call me the other day because I just reread the autobiography of Henry Ford. And he called me on the phone. He's like, man, I just listened to this episode. He goes, and I feel like running through a wall. And his point was that he's got a 9-to-5 job, or it's even more than that. He's an attorney. So it's like 7 a.m. to 7 at night job. But he wants to be an entrepreneur. He taught himself how to program in his spare time. He's got all these ideas. And he's like, man, I get home from work, I'm so tired, and I just don't do anything. And he goes, listening to what Henry Ford had to do, it ties into what you're saying. Is like, I just feel the reason I'm obsessed with history is because like they just did more. Like you read this life story, go back and read the Wikipedia page for somebody in like the early 1900s, late 1800s. It's like, how did one person do all of these things? And so he's like, I listened to the story you were telling, and it's like, this guy's Henry Ford's being an engineer and a machinist at an electrical company, working 12 hours a day. There was no fucking 8-hour workday. Like he helped pioneer that. It's like, there's no such thing. So he's working 12 hours a day. He comes home every night. He's trying to figure out how to make an internal combustion engine because most of the cars at the time were either electric or steam. And he's like, I'm not sitting on a steam. Like this shit will blow up. And so he works on that night, works on Saturdays, and then takes off on Sunday. That idea that he's fucking doing in his spare time turns into, in like the next 15 years, fast forwarding the story, he winds up owning 100% of the Ford Motor Company by 1919. That's like me and you owning a private $10 to $20 billion company 100% today.
It's like, amazing.
That's where it came from. And so but my friend was telling me, he's like, dude, you just inspired me. Like, I'm going to go out, I'm going to stay up, or I'm going to stay up late, get up early, maybe work on the weekend, whatever I have to do. But like when you read these stories, they just hold you to a higher bar. Because I randomly reread highlights. That's like my version of practice, right? Yeah. And I forgot about this guy. I quote him all the time because he's got one of the best quotes I've ever heard in the history of entrepreneurship. His name is Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser was as famous in his time as like Elon Musk is today. Right. He founded like 100 different companies. He built the fucking Hoover Dam. But he has a great line. He says, problems are just opportunities and work clothes. And so he would preach it. He'd preach it up and down his organization. He's like, you're bemoaning that we have a problem because we get paid to figure it out. So it's not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's just, you got to put on the work clothes to figure it out. And he had this unbelievable level of optimism that I think is almost extinct, unfortunately. But you just reread, I'm like, and that was like episode, I think, 66 of Founders. Since then, I've read like 200 and I don't know, another 200 something biographies of entrepreneurs. And I go back, I'm like, oh, like how did that one person accomplish all that in his entire life? And he did it in one lifetime. He wasn't even that old when he died. I think he was like, 70 years old or whatever the case was. So yeah, and it ties back to me and you were talking about before we started recording. One of my favorite lines in the biography of Alexander Graham Bell is he comes over here. And he's Scottish, and he's just like, Americans are crazy. Like he's trying to build a company. He's competing with a bunch of other people they're all doing telephone and telegraph experiments at the same time. And he says this great line. He's like, America is the refuge for all the ruffians in the world. And that word ruffian, I never used it in my vocab. I was like, that's exactly what it is. Like, I literally spend 7 days a week making a podcast on the history of entrepreneurship. And then I'll get an email every once in a while. They're like, why are so many people you cover Americans? I'm like, because it's on the history of entrepreneurship. It's like, I will read books. Like some of my favorite books is like a Chung Ju Young, which is the founder of Hyundai. That's the most inspiring autobiography I've ever read. It's episode 117. The guy, he grows up so poor. He's the son of a poor farmer. They have to eat tree bark in the winter to survive. He winds up dying the richest man in Korea. And I was like, oh, he's the founder of Hyundai. I thought, like, he makes cars. That's like one thing he did. And he did that towards the end of his life. He didn't. Yep. He like built the largest shipyard in the world, had this gigantic construction company, did all kinds of, his story is fascinating. So my point is, like, yeah, I'll read about anybody that's interesting. But unquestionably, there's something in the ethos, the DNA, whatever it is in the early history of America that it aligns perfectly with people that take risks and that build companies and that start something. And they have Americans have. I don't think I think that's obviously changing now. The world's getting smaller, but so far in the first, if you want to consider, my opinion, you could trace the history of entrepreneurship in its form. Like, there's talking about like modern capitalists. Not the same thing as like going around killing people for money, or like or confiscating land and titles and that kind of stuff. But I think if you trace back to Benjamin Franklin in this mid 1700s in America, because he was, think about it, he built maybe the first vertically integrated media company ever existed. And if you figure how many entrepreneurs that came after him that reference him and reading his autobiography and his biographies as like they motivated them to do something, including like Thomas Mellon, the patriarch of from Carnegie Mellon and the huge banking family. He talks about in his writing, in his bank, he had a bust of Benjamin Franklin. And this is like in the 1800s. And he's like, I'm reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, and this guy had less money than me, worse circumstances. And look at all the things he was able to accomplish, not only financially, but, in science and politics and everything else. He's like, I need to get off my ass and get going. And so I think that just speaks to, it's like, there's just this DNA in the early American history that is in perfect alignment with the same kind of characteristics that you find in entrepreneurs.
So many jumping off points here. And the one I'm going to veer to is like another thing that we were talking about is, I think that there is a genetic component to risk taking. And I don't know enough about the science of genetics to like assert that as a thesis that can be tested, right? But from all of my reading, from all of the people that I've had the great pleasure of meeting, I've met a ton of founders, names that like everybody knows. Mm-hmm. And I just become obsessed with the similarities that are in a lot of these people. And of course, one of my weaknesses, like I'm a quant, right? So I build algorithms in my mind all the time. I'm building an algorithm around you right now. And it's like, I can't help myself, right? And so I know that there's a lot of differences. I know that, as you yourself pointed out, very few true founders have anything resembling a life-work balance, right? Everyone talks about life-work balance. I don't know. In my own case, like I was so obsessed that, I did take my kids to Nantucket, but the back of our Ford Explorer was taken up mostly by my computers. Remember that you don't remember because you're too young, but the monitors were like this big. For everyone listening, I'm showing a massive monitor. And it was because I was obsessed with writing the book, What Works on Wall Street. And like I had to do a lot of crazy things to get that data. And then once I got it and I realized that the backtesting program that they thought worked didn't work, I literally had to do it by hand, year by year. And back in the day, like I had 2 Pentium and I had 2 CD-ROM drives, and I had to have that computer specially made in Stamford, Connecticut. And like all of the geeks there were like gathered around. They're like, dude, what are you going to build a nuclear power plant? And I'm like, no, actually I'm doing stock market research. But like they ported it over to CD-ROMs from their mainframe. I got the data from CompuServe, but I became so obsessed with it that I still have the journals where I had to do it by hand. And so when you have to do a year by hand, you got to be a little obsessed, but you also have to be like just thrilled to like having this huge opportunity of like, look at this, man. I get 50 years of data to actually test if buying stocks with low PEs works. And if it works, how well does it work? How often? What's the worst case scenario? So like really super excited about it. And then I just started noticing as my career expanded and I met a broader group of people, many founders like me, I was just like, wow, there's just a lot that we have in common. And so I'd love your thoughts about that. Like you yourself are like, in my mind, at least, a kind of a perfect example of a founder mentality because like you're obsessed with what you do it incredibly well. And like, oh, it's my pleasure. I mean, like the beauty here is that like people like you who have these gifts and talents now exist in an environment that 20 years ago you couldn't have done what you're doing right now.
100%. That's why it's like, if you think about founders, it's like your natural hobbies are natural, like your passions. Jeff Bezos has a couple good lines related to what you said. He's like, listen, we don't choose our passions, choose us. Right. I think that's dead on. And then he also talks about like for people with founder mentality, it's like, it's not work-life balance, it's work-life harmony. Like that is the way to think about it. There is nothing balanced about these people. The way I think about it, and this is an idea really I think I stole from Charlie Munger, where he's read hundreds of biographies, and I'll eventually catch him. But I have hopefully many years ahead of me. But he says it's like the reason that he does that as opposed to like just reading like a business book. He's like, it's just better if you can tie the ideas to the personality that developed them, and you understand like why. That's why if you were to look at the books that I have highlights on, it's like 90% of my highlights come in like the first like 40 years of their life, 50 years of their life. Like when they're trying to figure out who they are as a person, when they're trying to build a company, like that is like, because I want to know why did they make that decision? And part of that, you have to understand like some things that happened in their childhood, who they were. But I don't think you can prove this. And this is, again, fresh in my mind because I just read Sam Zell's autobiography, but he believed that too. And he was trying to donate a bunch of money to like, I think, the University of Michigan because he wanted to start like this college of entrepreneurship. And I don't think it ever materialized because he talks about like trying to donate money and no one would ever call him back, which is kind of weird. But then he started saying stuff like, he's like, I've just always been like this. Like his very first business was he was growing up in Highland Park, a suburb of Chicago. He'd go to the city of Chicago and there'd be things for sale in Chicago. Like he says the very first entrepreneurial like endeavor was buying the issue of Playboy magazine with Marilyn Monroe on it, which is probably, when this was happening, maybe in the 1960s, something like that, maybe 1950s.
Yeah, 50s with Monroe.
He'd buy it for 50 cents in the city, bring it back to Highland Park, and his friend's like, I'll give you $3 for that.
Arbitrage, babe.
And I just noticed like I spend so much time thinking and reading about, well, let me back up a step and then I'll answer your question directly. There's a great line in Phil Knight's autobiography, Shoe Dog, right? And that's one of, like, it's hard to say there's a perfect entrepreneur autobiography, but Shoe Dog may be it. And I think people discount it because it sold millions of copies and it's so popular. But the fact that every chapter is named after a year and it takes you into chronological order from the time he has the idea for Nike and struggling to see what that's going to be to up to the IPO. It's like perfect for me. But he says something in there that I think a lot of people can benefit from. He's like, what the hell is going on? Like he wrote a paper when he was at Stanford. I think this is graduate school. And he's like, hey, I'm just going to do exactly what the Japanese are doing for cameras for running shoes. It's like, and for electronics, like the Germans are dominating running shoes. It's Adidas and Puma and all this other stuff. He's like, I'm going to import Japanese running shoes. They're cheaper. And then I'm going to sell them. And then eventually make some. But so he the very first Nike sales, what turns into Nike is like, he orders these from Japan, right? He stuffs them in his trunk, drives around. He also ran track at Oregon. So he'd go to track meets all around the state of Oregon and he'd just pop his trunk and say, here's what I have for sale. And every single time he'd sell out. So then he's driving home one day and you see his inner monologue is an early 20 something, probably like 24 at the time. And he's like, what the hell is happening? He's like, I tried to sell encyclopedias, couldn't sell encyclopedias. I got a job selling mutual funds, couldn't do that. He's like, what's taking place here? And he's like, oh, I realized that I'm not, he goes, belief is irresistible. I believe Nike, the foundation of Nike, one of the most valuable companies ever made, is like, I have the fundamental belief that if people get out and run a few miles every day, the world would be a better place. And running was not popular then. Okay. He would be running on the side of the road and people would throw like soda at him outside the window. And so that version was like, damn, that's stuck in my mind. I read this years ago. I've read it, I think, twice since then. But I was like, that's how I feel about reading biographies. I feel like the world would be a better place if I can encourage people. You don't have to read 300 like I'm approaching. That's insane. But you can read one a month. Like, come on. Like everybody's busy, but like you could read 6 a year, 6 to 12 a year. I legitimately believe if more people read biographies, their lives would be better, because like essentially the way I think about it is like, I'm watching game tape the same way that Kobe or LeBron or any other athlete on the planet watches tape of not only their games, but people that came before them. That's what reading biographies is for everybody. Right. And especially for entrepreneurs, like the history of entrepreneurship is very clear on this. You do not get to the top of your profession without mastering the best work that came before you. They all have deep historical knowledge. You wouldn't fucking believe it. It's unbelievable. So where was I going with this?
Yeah. That's the question. You were going with the obsession and yeah.
It's inherent. So the reason I think it make your life better and the world a better place as a result of that is because you see they're not choosing entrepreneurship. He was a 13-year-old boy going through puberty when he picked up that magazine. You know what I mean? Or maybe 17, whatever the case is. They all have these like weird little stories that show, hey, I'm comfortable being an outlier. Because even now there is, a entrepreneurial industry per se, right? But it's still a weird fucking thing to do. Like, it is weird. And so you talked about through your work, you get to meet other founders, right? The best thing, and this happens to me too, and I don't go out to many, parties where I don't know people, but if I do, I seek out the people that are entrepreneurs because you could talk to them. Like, I meet a ton of people I've never met. They've listened to the podcast, like, hey, I'm in your city. You want to have dinner or you want to have coffee? And invariably we'll talk for like an hour, 2-3 hours because we have the same exact interests. And there is just I do think there is like a weird genetic thing to it. But it's also like, and I'm very skeptical that it can be like taught or like the drive is just there. It's not. No one has to tell me. Like, I just went on another podcast and they ended the podcast because it was an investor podcast, and it's all about like reading books and constant like learning machines that most investors and entrepreneurs are. And they're like, do you have advice for people that want to read more? And I think I hit him with like the stanky face. I was like, no one has to tell me. Like, if somebody has to tell you to do something, that's a bad sign. No one had like, and I told him, I was like, okay, yeah, pick up a book and stare at it. Like that. It's as simple as that. If somebody's having to push you, if you need this external drive, right? Or if somebody says, hey, you should get up early, you should work a little bit more, you should come up with ideas, you should experiment, then you're just not, there's nothing wrong with that. You should just go get a job and you should work for somebody that built a company that no one had to tell them to build the company. There's a great. Oh, God.
Just like I just was thinking of the Banksy quote, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it was like, you can't imagine what I could have achieved had somebody else motivated me. Of course, Banksy is everywhere. Yeah. He's the king of spray can art. I could not agree with you more completely about this whole motivation thing, man. Listen, if you want the hard truths of life, like, you can go to a Tony Robbins seminar, and I don't mean, and I'm not banging on him, like, God bless Tony, but you can go to one of those seminars and like you get super jazzed for 2 days, and then you're going to revert to your habitual behavior. And like, if you can't like work up in yourself the desire to go do that thing or read that book or do whatever, it's like, I don't know how you teach somebody to be curious, for example. And that's another thing. Like, I think the world would be a much better place like you if people read a lot more, not just biographies, but read a lot more. And like, okay, why do people start reading? Because they're curious and they want to know. And like, when you're curious, it's like Dorothy Parker has a great line. The cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity. No, and then there was a great woman who got a great quote, something along the lines of, curiosity is a shit starter. And it really is, man. But I don't know, like, if somebody came to me as an investor, right? And they go like, can you clone David? Can you just like get a dozen Davids and we'll start them reading different things. So David owns entrepreneur biographies. Let's get somebody who can own architecture. Let's get somebody who can own art history. Let's get somebody who can own, tech and development. And then like, let's do a media empire, right? Yeah. Okay. First off, I got to clone you. Can I find people like you? You may be. But the fact is, if I'm finding people like you, they're already doing the thing, right? Yes. I'm not going to find somebody like you sitting there just waiting for Jim to come along and say, hey, David, why don't you, all those biographies you like to read? Why don't you maybe make a living from it? You're going to do it already.
Michael Jordan actually has a great quote about this, because this is what I also see is like, oh, investors like, we're on the search for, the next great founders. It's like, no, that founder is coming. And your point is to make sure you're aware and open to the possibility of meeting with them and then teaming. You have the relationship reversed. And so his whole point is like, at the end of his career, they're like, who's the next Michael Jordan? It's going to be Kobe. It's going to be all these other people. And he said something great. He's like, you don't have to search for the next Michael Jordan. First of all, you didn't find me. That's what he said. That was funny.
Exactly.
He goes, the next one is coming along. It will happen. You don't have to do anything. And that's exactly how I think about the founder's journey. Let me give you an example of going back to this idea of like, it's inherent. You can't tell people about it. Like one of the craziest stories I did not fucking know until I started doing the podcast, right? Everybody knows what the Pulitzer Prize is, right? I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I was like, let me read the life stories of people behind, like I read the biography of Alfred Nobel, right? Because everybody knows Nobel Prize. And behind every great brand that's psychopathic, like I talked to Patrick about this, where like if you have like an Apple or a Ferrari or a Rolls Royce or an Estee Lauder company, behind all these brands that last for generations and decade after decade is like, you can inevitably trace it back to one obsessed psychotic founder. Right. And so, yes. But with the Nobel Prize and with the Pulitzer Prize, it's the same thing. So Joseph Pulitzer's life story, I think this is like founders 135, 136, somewhere in there. Right. So it's been, probably a year and a half since I read this book, but I never forgot it because he starts out in Hungary. Right. And by the time he is 17, there's like some kind of disease. I forgot what everybody's dying from. It's his parents have 9 children. By the time he's 17, the only survivors are Joseph, his brother, and his mother. Imagine the pain that he had to endure by the time he's 17. Take that, the life experience of an average American 17-year-old. They can't even relate. So then he's in Hungary. His family, his dad was an entrepreneur, but now he's dead. So like now he's got to support his mom, right? You are the man of the family. What are you going to do, Joseph? And so this is around the American Civil War. There was a group of wealthy Boston businessmen that were paying young European teenagers, right, to fight for the Union in the Civil War. So they're like, Joseph's like, I got to get the hell out of Hungary. There's no opportunity. This is exactly what we talked about. It's like America was the beacon. It's like, that's where you go to make your fortune. So he's like, he literally was willing to risk his life, right? So he comes over. That's his ticket to America. He's like, I can't get there anywhere. They'll pay a small stipend and they get over there. He survives the Union, the Civil War, thank God, right? And there's a great line in the book. It says within 5 years, he goes from being a bounty hunting Hungarian teenager to an American lawmaker. So this goes back to what we were talking about, how you read their like biographies or Wikipedia pages, like how do they accomplish so much so fast? And so goes back to the reading thing. He says, when I came to America, I was tongueless, guideless, and friendless, meaning he did not speak English. He didn't know anybody. And, he had no mentors or whatever. So what does he do? He goes and he gets a job and he spends, it's like $2 a month, which is pretty expensive at the time, for a membership at a library. He shows up there when the library opens. He sits down with 2 apples and he reads all day long. And the 2 apples is because I don't have time to go to lunch. And so I'm going to eat these apples. And then he winds up being a newspaper reporter, gets elected to Congress, builds the entire like media, the way our media is, because he's like a pioneer in yellow journalism, unfortunately. Like his playbook was copied by William Randolph Hearst, who built obviously this gigantic media company. He was worth like the equivalent of like $30 billion today. Right. But Pulitzer has this, he just builds this empire. He winds up buying a bunch of newspapers, selling newspapers, and then winds up, his life story it goes on for quite a bit, but it ends in a kind of crazy way because he winds up going blind. And so he's so rich, he starts circumnavigating the globe. His last years are spent on his yacht, circumnavigating the globe as he slowly went blind. But just the amount of pain and struggle that person had to endure, and the fact that he started with less than nothing. It's like, you don't even have at least some people have their family still alive, even if they can't support you financially. Like, that's just an insane story. And the history of entrepreneurship and the history of anybody doing anything difficult. It could be, I just read a biography of the partnership, which I didn't even know, between George Washington and Ben Franklin, right? Yeah. Like politicians, people that have started religions, a movement, an idea, a company. It's my fundamental belief that when I say the founders are the most important people in the world, I mean anybody that starts something from scratch. I don't care what it is. It could be a company, it could be a family, it could be an organization, it could be a charity, all of that. It's somebody that's so psychopathic and such an outlier to say, hey, this thing doesn't exist in the world, and I'm willing to give my entire life energy to make sure that it exists. That's insane.
So, the only thing I would quibble on there is, like, you're using psychopathic in the more what I would call fun version of the word. True psychopaths are, for the most part, fairly rare, and like fairly dangerous.
For sure.
And so I don't know, maybe we could find a word like that that distills everything you've just said, but makes them, that not have to worry about taking the shower and having them come in and stab you to death.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Because Norman Bates was an entrepreneur, man. He had a motel. So, like, I am so fascinated by it, just like you are. And like all of my life, I have read constantly, endlessly, and then listened. And just because of the pure pleasure that it gives, right? I just love learning new things. And like, when you're willing to admit like that you're wise in the Socratic sense of knowing that if anything, so little that like, and if you read, you'd fucking know that, because you would look at what the most educated people of 500 years ago believed, and it was all wrong.
Yep.
and
it would be arrogant to think that we're not making the same mistake now.
Exactly.
And I think the better word than psychopathic is obsessive.
Yes.
They're obsessive.
Yes. Absolutely.
Whatever it is, they're just
whatever it is. Yeah. Exactly. And that's kind of like I said earlier about like always building these algorithms in my head. I'm always trying to figure out, right? It's like, because, honestly, I have thought, would it be cool to like be able to round up a dozen Davids and like put it together in a little business and, but you're absolutely right. The way I would do it is I just go out and look, see who's doing it already right now. Because like and that's the other part that really excites me. We're going through what I call the great reshuffle, and all the old models are collapsing, and people don't understand that. And it scares them, and they're 100%. Frightened about it. But so what's happening is going to be so, in my opinion, I'm usually wrong, so take that grain of salt. But in my opinion, is going to be so extraordinary that like there are going to be like we talk about who's going to be the next Michael Jordan. I submit to you that even you and I, who like read like maniacs and know these types of founders and everything, if we try to put pen to paper, and David and you and I were like just united on this thing, and we tried to name the 10 top professions in 2035, we'd be wrong on 9 of them.
100%.
They have not been invented yet.
Okay. I just got in trouble because my daughter, she was in 4th grade last year, and she asked me, she's like, Daddy, will you please talk a career day, because like you get paid to talk and read, and this is just a weird thing, like a weird business, right? And so I show up to class, first of all. And so first of all, the teachers are like, okay, where's your PowerPoint? And I was like, what do you mean? She goes, well, every parent has had a PowerPoint. And they're like, where's yours? I go, and my response was, I would never subject to kids to such a thing.
I love you.
And so I go, I'm just going to talk to them for 2 minutes, and then we're going to have a dialogue. And so I get up there and I'm like, listen, don't listen to what your parents say. Don't listen to what your teachers say. It's highly likely that you guys are 9 years old. You're in 4th grade. It's highly likely what you're going to do for your career hasn't been invented yet. And I know that because there was no such thing as a podcaster when I was your age. Like it wasn't even a profession, considered a profession up until 10 years ago. I go, The important thing is read all the time. What are you truly interested in? It doesn't matter what your parents should think that you're interested in. It doesn't matter what your teachers are saying or your friends. What do you think about all the time? What do you read about? What do you learn about? What do you watch YouTube about? Follow that. Because then like nobody can compete with you on being you. And only you know what you actually truly like, and not what society or other people want to tell you to do. And then I go from there, then just keep learning and try to basic advice. Like, don't be a shithead. I didn't curse, they were younger, but we had this conversation, and then I go, okay,
listen, you motherfuckers.
But like, seriously, it was like 2 to 5 minutes, and they give you like 30 minutes. And I go, okay, then no more presentation, because presentations are boring. Let's have a conversation. What questions do you have for me? And when my daughter got home that day, she goes, Daddy, everybody in class said your presentation was their favorite, because like I actually involved them. Like they're super curious. And this is my problem with schooling in general, and why like me and my wife have a bit of point of contention, because she's like, well, what would you do? You would just have her like you would you homeschool or whatever? I was like, she's really smart. Like, and she has the internet. Let her figure out, like, you need to know basic stuff, math, reading, writing, that kind of stuff. But they're still teaching, like, even when you look at the curriculum, which I think a lot of parents realized when we went through the pandemic and you saw all those like Zoom school, like, what are they actually learning? It's not really about education. It's like some kind of like hybrid, like insurance, future insurance against like getting a job to like daycare is essentially what it is. It's very little to do with education. You can learn way more in an hour or two on your own than you can 8 hours a day, with a group of 40 other people.
Could not agree with you more completely. The vestiges of our public education in this country are based on the late 19th century when we started to industrialize, and the industrialists told the government, listen, you know what we need you to do? We need you to train people to be content to sit for fucking 8 hours in a room doing the same thing. And they were getting them ready for the manufacturing line. And like, that is so removed from what we have available to us today. Your daughter, for example, there's a school that I follow called the Synthesis School, which is based on Ad Astra, that Musk started to educate the kids who were living at the factory, right?
The head evangelist lives in Miami. You've had her on the show.
I had her on the show.
Yeah,
she's wonderful. And like, what I love about it is, because I've looked into it, because I have 3 grandkids. And like, you can't pull kids away from real learning because they're curious. And our educational system, essentially, and I'm not saying this like it's conspiratorial, because I don't think it is, but our educational system as it exists right now is one of those collapsing old models. It doesn't work anymore. It is trying to teach people what to think, not how to think. And what to think? Well, I need a job. I need a good job at a corporation. And that's all bullshit. And like, anyone who has an internet connection can understand that. And they can, as you say, follow their passion. And the tools that are available right now, I mean, for example, Patrick's podcast. If you want an MBA, I would say don't get an MBA. Listen to everything on Patrick's podcast. Oh, you want to be a founder? Listen to David's podcast. Listen to all of them and then read them. Your education from that is going to be vastly better than from taking an entrepreneurship class somewhere.
And then some of the plans, because me and Patrick talk about this all the time. We had this discussion the other day. It's like, listen, like, let's say you're trapped on an island. The only access you can have, forget the island part, but the only educational access you can have is literally the back catalog of Invest Like the Best and the back catalog of Founders and everything we do forward. And then all the ideas that Patrick and I have, not only like to remix that audio content, to have like to actually, there's software layers, there's like reinforcement of certain principles over and over again. There's the translation to text and atomic pieces of content and all these other discussions that we're having. And it's like that alone is better than anything that existed on the planet 30 years ago. It did not
Absolutely.
exist. This is what I loved. I was watching your interview with David Perell, and he gets it right away, where he's like, for the first time, if you think about like the education system, the process you were just describing, they actually solved the problem, which because I've read about a ton of, obviously American history in the 1800s, 1900s, education had no scale. And so the public education system had to solve for scale. It's like, how do you make sure that you have at least a baseline of education? And then the world changed, and now there's a different problem. But what David Perell has a really good idea. It's like, for the first time, an educator has scale. And so if you're the best in the world at what you're teaching, you get to teach it for everybody, because our entire world is dominated by power laws. That is why I'm so obsessed and focused, and why I won't allow myself to think about anything else but building founders. And I work 7 days a week on this, is because my goal is not to be the biggest podcast on the history of entrepreneurship. It's to be the best. Because if I'm the best, I get to do it for everybody. And I think it's arrogant to think that I will be able to be the best in the world at something, even if it's a small niche, right? A small but valuable niche, right? But it's arrogant to think that you can be the best in the world and I can multitask and think about other things, And that's where I feel I have an edge, where it's like, oh, my podcast is not a means to an end. It is an end. I think if I never did anything else, and there's obviously a ton of opportunities, there's an unlimited amount of opportunities based on who listens, and the fact that your son put it the best way. It's like, what people don't understand about what you and I do, David, is that we make educational content for the most successful people in the world. If you saw the people that listen to Invest Like the Best and listen to Founders, it is some of the smartest and most successful people in the world. And so my whole thing is like, I'm not trying to build the biggest podcast, because I'm not dumbing anything down. Like there's a great, Andy Grove wrote that fantastic book, Only the Paranoid Survive. One thing I am paranoid of is wasting anybody's time. Even now, like the opportunity, you give me an opportunity to come on your podcast, you give me a great platform to introduce my ideas and maybe my podcast to other people. It's like, okay, then like I spend every day studying. Not only am I reading every day, which is how many people are reading their first 3 to 4 hours every day of their lives? Very few people, 7 days a week. Then I spend the afternoon talking to other founders and rereading past highlights. It's like, I want to be perpetually prepared. And so right now I'm making one episode every week. And so that means every 1 hour of recorded audio, I read at least 20 hours to produce that 1 hour because I am extremely paranoid of wasting anybody's time. I want people to say, hey, if I press play on this podcast, I know for a fact David did his homework, that he actually did a ton of research. And that's why I have the bar so high. It's like, I'm only doing episodes where I have to read an entire book for every episode. Like, that's not going to change because like, it's also David Perell, and you talked about the idea of having a personal monopoly. And I think it's in line with what we're talking about with not only education, kids' education, but also careers. It's like take Warren Buffett's idea of how you build a moat, right? And so I was thinking about this the other day, and Patrick picked up on this the very first time I got on the phone with him. He already listened to a bunch of episodes. He picked up on this right away, where Warren Buffett has this great saying. He's like, okay, if I give you $25 billion and I tell you, take away the market leadership of Coke, what is the right thing to do? And he says, give me back the money because it can't be done. And what Patrick picked up on, he's like, your podcast is complete and you're so far ahead that even if somebody said, hey, I want to get in, this is a good idea, I want to get in and I want to start competing with you right away, he's like, they'll never fucking catch you. It's like game, set, match. As long as you don't quit and you keep getting better at it and you stay focused, which I obviously going to, I hope to do this for the rest of my life. I think I said on the episode I did with him that went viral unexpectedly. And maybe I didn't say this, but I was like, to get me to stop, they're going to have to pry the microphone on my cold, dead hand. Because I found the thing that is unique. It goes back to what we were talking about that I jotted down on this notepad while you were talking. I believe that the life is a search for it's a constant search to find what you are uniquely qualified to do. Right. And then once you find it, you do it forever because knowledge compounds just like money does, Yep. But you have to keep looking until you find it. And I got this idea from this guy named Edwin Land, who's the founder of Polaroid, who's a Steve Jobs hero. And I read something that he said that was just fantastic and helped me like put blinders on, like, how race horses have blinders on.
Yep.
I have that blinders on focus where it's like, he goes, I have a personal motto. It's very personal. It may not apply to anybody else, but he's like, don't do anything that somebody else can do. And so once you start looking at viewpoints, like, am I the only person that can do what I'm going to do? And that means imbibing your personality into what you're doing. The fact that, like, when we started talking, I was like, Jim, what I love about you is, like, I've listened to enough of your podcast. Like, because it's weird. Where, like, I told you, I like that you curse because, like, business people are extreme people, investors, entrepreneurs, these are extreme people. And sometimes they get on and they do these interviews and it's like this, like, weird, like, mask, like, public relations, like, they take it like some extreme brilliant person and you try to make them seem like normal and relatable, but they're not normal and they're not relatable because if they did, they would have never started the company to begin with. And I think leaning into your eccentricities and keep getting more like narrowly focused on what can I do that no one else in the world can do is just good to build a personal monopoly and using Warren Buffett's term, a moat that you can actually build a sustainable, valuable business around.
Absolutely. And, so many great things to continue the conversation there. The idea of compression, right? So, like, I'm very interested in AI, and what is, like, turning heads right now is there's a company with the ability that they have, like what the show Silicon Valley was about. They have, like, this killer, they have a killer compression algorithm in AI. And what it's able to do is take, like, 200 terabytes of data and compress it to 2 gig. Where does that fit? It fits on your phone. It fits on your laptop. It fits on your iPad. And, like, so compression, right, is what you do. You got to read 20 hours to speak an hour. That sounds about right to me. It's like, for example, I cannot be scripted. I smiled when you said that about, like, having the entrepreneur on and they're like sitting there like, thank you for having me on, Dave. I want to tell you about our exciting new opportunities with, it's all bullshit, man. And, like, we have all sorts of failings in human OS, but one of them is not the inability to see fake, inauthentic bullshit. 100%. And people call people on that, like, instantly. We've got that. And you know why? Because, well, wait a minute. Did we spend almost all of our time in tribes hunting and gathering? Yeah, we did. Why would it be good for a person to know that another person was full of shit? Well, their very survival depended on it, right? Yeah. There's some people whose theory of why we develop language, and I'm talking serious PhDs, right? I read those papers too.
Yeah.
And like, there is a theory that language was developed so that we could gossip.
Oh,
Think
yeah.
about that for a minute.
Yes.
Like, of course, like if you and I are in the same hunter-gatherer tribe, right? And we don't know how to talk. We have no language. So we're, and we're pointing at Grog, right? Because both of us think there's something off about Grog. Well, now when we talk, we don't want to risk our own identity to call out Grog, and maybe the rest of the tribe thinks we're full of shit, right? And then they exile us and we're dead in under a day. Because that world, by the way, was not this whole idea, let's go back to nature. Listen, man, you don't want to go back to nature because it was nasty, brutish, and short. And like every comfort that we have today came out of the minds of human beings.
Yeah.
And so like, but it's my right. Your rights came out of the minds of human beings. There is no such a thing as natural rights. Yeah, your natural right is that you don't get eaten by it's not a right. It's like luck. I don't get eaten by the bear or the tiger or the lion, and it's not my right. It's because I can run like hell, right? But the whole point of the idea of like, it comes out of our minds, and we develop language because now with language, I can like think that Grog's a layabout. And like, what was the word? A ruffian that you used in the question?
Ruffian.
Yeah. I think Grog over there is a ruffian. So instead of broadcasting that to the tribe, I know that you probably think the same thing. And I sidle up next to you and I'm like, hey, David, what's going on? And you're like, not much, just avoided death 4 times today. So good day.
Yeah.
And then I say, dude, what do you think of Grog over there, man? And then you're like, honestly, I think Grog is kind of a lazy fucker. Right? And so it all ends up with, that's how the communication starts. The rest of the tribe is silently brought on side and Grog's gone. So, but the point is, like, that stuff is just so cool to me. And if you like understand, why do we do certain things the way we do them? Well, for the most part, you can either follow the money or follow the evolution. Right. So follow the evolution. Our brains are basically designed to keep us alive. I mean, that's what our brains are basically for. And then, of course, we had this incredible when we discovered fire. And this is the other thing that drives me crazy. I want to get your opinion on it. Like every innovation normally comes with widespread horror. Right. So when radio got introduced, right, everybody said, the radio waves will kill you. And you can find actual newspapers in the microfiche or the way back machine that show a story with a dead bird and then the headline, did radio waves kill this bird? But what's interesting is same thing for bicycles in the late 1800s, same thing for movies. They're going to ruin theater, every innovation.
There's also an interesting thought there too. Not only like the humans, like societal response to change is like predictable. It's like, no, they don't want it, right? Even though their entire foundation of our life is just one, like we're all laying on the foundation of change, layer after layer of somebody else's change that came before us. But what I found interesting also is like, usually the people that are making the change and the inventors and founders can't even predict what their product is going to be used for. Perfect example. I just reread a 60-year-old biography of Thomas Edison. This is the 3rd book I've read on Thomas Edison. Because I also think it's like, if you find something interesting, it's not enough to read one book. Like I'll read 5, 6, 7, I'll do podcast after podcast on them. But like, he obviously invented, forget the electric light, which is amazing. But like what we're doing right now, recorded audio. That is Thomas Edison, except he called it a phonograph. And so he makes the first ability to record audio and play it back at a later time. That was Edison, right? You know what he thought? One of his guests, he makes a list of what this invention is going to be used for, right? And his idea was, hey, if you go to somebody's house and then like today you go to somebody's house and they have like a wine cellar, and it's like all this store of wines. He said that you're going to have a recorded like audio cellar in your house or area in your house. And so you can listen to preachers, sermons, like past sermons of preachers. So you're going to come over like, hey, do you and your wife want to come over for dinner? And then after dinner, we're going to sit there. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about, Edison? Like, this is insane. Steve Jobs made the point too, because I love the way, like, Steve Jobs is my all-time favorite entrepreneur.
Mine too, actually.
It's like, yes, he had a certain type of genius. What I think is his most admirable trait and something I'm trying to emulate to the tiniest degree, and I'll probably never be as good as he is at it. It's his clarity of thought. I have never come across a more clear thinker, and I've read like 12 books on him. And not only do I have read dozens of books on him, but then if he talks about his heroes or the people he influenced, like Bell, like Land, like the founders of HP, Andy Grove, I'll go and chase down their biographies too. So I accounted for this the other, like a few months ago, and I realized I've done 39 episodes on Steve Jobs or one of Steve Jobs' influences. And so like I'll like map all that out. But he goes, the way you have to think about what you're doing is like we're tool builders, right? Which is exactly what most of what we're doing. The people listening to this podcast, me and you, we're building tools. Like my podcast is a tool for thought. It's like, I think of ideas as tools. You're going to hear probably 1,000 different ideas from the history of good entrepreneurs. You'll pick out 5 or 10 that you're going to use in ways we can't predict. And so the reason he goes, listen, I'm a tool maker, but I know that I can't possibly predict what my tools will be used for in the future. He was talking about the personal computer. This is the Apple II. You're talking about this is 1976, right? And he uses the example later on that he goes, there's no way Alexander Graham Bell could have possibly predicted that when he invented the telephone, that somebody 100 years later is going to be using that telephone to call up the movie theater to find out the time of the movie. Now you don't do that. But like at his time, it's like that was very popular. Like that was something that was done. It's like, there's no way. Just focus on maximizing what your tool can do, and then trust that humans are going to find ways to use the tools that you build there's no way you can predict.
I mean, like, again, I'm kind of thinking, what can I ask David that I'm going to disagree with him on? Because like, honestly, that, for example, the French people who came up with motion pictures, do you know what they thought? Do you know what their forecast was? How they were going to be used? They were only going to be used to film theater productions. and I passionately believe that. In all the businesses that I've started, my rule is hire people that are smarter than I am, and then let them be smart at what they do. So I push all decisions down to the people actually using the tools, right? Yeah. Because what the fuck do I know? And like, so at OSAM, which Patrick ultimately still is CEO of, and I founded and started, like when we were putting together the team as we rolled out of Bear, one of the guys who worked for me, he came into my office and he's like, okay, we got to decide on trading systems. And I looked at him and I'm like, dude, what? And he goes, we have to decide on what trading system we're going to buy. And I went, first off, you and I are not going to make any decision on what trading systems we're going to buy. Yeah. Chris, because I remember the last time I traded was with you in 1996 off a busted Excel spreadsheet because our trader was sick that day. And thank God we didn't fuck it up. But that's the extent of our knowledge about trading. What we're going to do, all those really smart people that we pay a lot of money to that trade all of our securities for us?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to let them tell us the tools they want for what they do. Yeah. And, we had the same experience with Canvas. Like, so Patrick and I are very simpatico in many ways. And like, for example, most people hated custom indexing, which was Patrick's he came up with that term. Mm-hmm. And I personally thought literally that was the most brilliant thing he did around the whole thing. Because what he did was, again, you got to be really fucking smart to figure this out, or lucky. So indexing, when indexes were born, people hated them. They hated them with a passion. News stories were just about how they were un-American, seeking to be average. No American does that. Seeking to be average, that's horrible, right?
Yeah.
Well, then index go on to beat everyone else for 20 years, and everyone loves indexes. Oh, indexes are the greatest thing in the world. What have they done? They've conquered neural real estate, right? With all of these great impressions. Patrick comes along and says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to hijack that neural real estate, and I'm going to put the term custom, which sounds pretty cool, in front of it. And bang, a new category in asset management is born. And as we're selling it, I'm trying to get our counterparties to really understand the importance of this. And they did, obviously, they bought us. But like, I would say, the team would say, well, what are you worried about? I'm said, like, I'm really worried if we don't have a competitor in 6 months. Because if we don't have a competitor by then, or 12 months at the outside, we're wrong. And they're like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And so obviously we have a huge lead, like your lead with your back catalog. Same with Patrick's lead with his back catalog. Like you get to a point where you're so far ahead that it's going to be really hard to catch you. And as far as the tech goes, we were and are so far ahead that it's going to be hard for them, even if they throw a ton of money. And by the way, every big asset manager is right now. And I cannot tell you how happy I was when I saw an advertisement where Fidelity, the Fido is the 800-pound gorilla in asset management for retail, right? What did they introduce? The new custom index from Fidelity. And I'm like, oh, thank God. Because if you control the term of art, like that's your baby. And you're like the de facto leader. But one thing Patrick and I did, and he got some advice from one of his VC buddies, which we took very seriously. And the advice was what your point about the founder not being able to imagine what other people are going to use the tool for. So a lot of our folks were like really excited, like we should do this feature first. And that's natural. I love to see them absolutely into it and like really behind it. But Patrick and I were talking about it, and he's like, what we should do is just have like a limited group of investment advisors we trust, and then we should let them tell us what they wanted to do. And God damn it, if they didn't, like, if I compared my original list of what I thought were going to be the most popular features with what actually are the most popular features, I maybe got 2 out of 10 right.
There's so many ideas here. We had this conversation, me and Patrick were talking about this the other day, because he knows like I'm up to like 15 acquisition offers on founders, and usually it comes from like VCs because it'd be a great like deal flow for them.
Sure.
And one thing that I think I've met a ton of smart venture capitalists, and I've met some not smart ones. Like, who the fuck gave you money? Like, kind of shit.
Right.
And the thing was, it's like, how could you possibly think? Like, I got this example. It's like, I've thought about the business of podcasting because it's been an obsession. Recorded audio before there was anything, audio in general, before there was anything such as a podcast. Like, I was completely obsessed with. Like, back when it was just AM radio. Back when you had to stream it from your browser and it would like buffer and like disconnect. Like, way before the actual invention of the term podcast, I was obsessed with. And so now I've thought about the business of podcasting every day for at least 6 years. And I'll get these emails where it's just like, hey, I've thought about this for 15 minutes, or I had some researcher that knows nothing about this. Here's a list of ideas. And I'm like, how could you possibly think this was valuable? That doesn't mean I know everything. Of course not. But I would at least appreciate you spending like hours and hours and thinking about something, and then not sending me like some stupid bullshit list that took you 15 minutes. Like, that's not helpful. And so Patrick was talking about that. He's like, if the founder is getting advice from me, so he's talking about the people he's investing in, right? Like, I met Michael from Tegas, and like that is an obsessive. Like, me and Michael we've talked for hours on the phone, but also through text. And it's just like, oh, like that guy has whatever I see in the books, that guy has. Like, I don't know if his company's really successful. I don't know anything about it. I'm not privy to the numbers or anything. Doesn't mean just because you're obsessed, you're going to succeed by any means. But it's like, right. Oh, he is on it the same exact way. And Patrick made the point. He's just like, well, if he is asking me like how to run his business, there's a problem here. He's like, it's the other way around. I'm there to give them resources so they could fulfill whatever they want to do. But I'm the one asking questions. It goes back to you have it backwards. It's like, you're not looking for the next Michael Jordan. Now Michael Jordan is coming, right? You should need to make sure that if they're a founder and you happen to invest in founders, that they're going to find you first. And you usually do that through content or through marketing or whatever the case is. But you just said something that was really smart that comes up over and over again. It's like, we know it's a good idea. Everybody knows it's a good idea, but it's hard to adhere to it. And that is usually in the beginning of these companies that I read about, you have to do this. And usually future generations of managers stop doing this to their own detriment. You have to put your trust into small groups of smart people.
Yes.
They will figure it out. Everybody knows it. Like, yes, David, they'll shake your head. Like, that's a good idea. I will do it. How many actually do it? It's so small. And this is something that Ed Catmull, the founder of Pixar, may be the greatest manager of creative and technical talent that ever lived. Right? If you figure that
he loved the Creativity Inc.
And Steve Jobs learned how to manage. He didn't know how to manage. If you see the first half of his career, he learned it from Ed. And then you go on, you figure all these other people that studied Pixar and learned directly from Ed. And that was his whole thing. He's like, listen, he goes, and a lot of investors do this too. And I think founders rightly do this as well. Like John D. Rockefeller, when he came across somebody smart, he hired him, even if he didn't have anything to do. He's like, I don't care. I'll find something like that dude is smart. Usually it's a guy in the 1800s. That guy's smart. Edwin Land, founder of Polaroid. Same thing. Smart person. You're on the staff. And because what Ed Catmull said, he's like, listen, he goes, if you give a great idea to a mediocre team, they'll mess it up. If you give a bad idea to a brilliant team, they'll throw it out and come up with something better. So he's like, you have to build your entire structure in your company. And in Pixar's case, Steve Jobs said this. He's like, listen, I don't think we're going to have the same level of talent that Pixar had because we're like 3,000 or 4,000 employees and they're 400. But they had 400 A players. He's like, he's like, I've never seen another company that had a larger concentration of talent than Pixar did. And I think there is something to be said. The larger your company gets, of course, the level of quality overall has to decrease. And so one thing I'm passionate about is like small teams of smart people being enabled by the technology that you and I were discussing in detail before we started recording. Like what you might not, you can make an outsized impact. What I'm trying to do myself is like, I want to make a large impact with not a lot of people. I never want to personally, this is just me personally, I never want to work at a company that has an HR department. Like, I don't want to deal with Barbara and accounting or any or saying, David, you can't use that language or all the other stuff. Right. And I think technology, like the amount of impact that a small group of smart people, you may never have to grow out of a small group of smart people in like my version of heaven would be that.
So, and again, like, I don't know, maybe they're going to ask for a DNA test. How old are you? I got to account for my whereabouts 39 years ago. Because
okay, hold on. The hilarious part about that is if you saw a picture. So my wife, right? We grew up completely different. Did you watch Game of Thrones?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so you'll get this. Okay, where I ask other people and the analogy falls apart, right? And so she grew up in Highgarden and I grew up in Flea Bottom, right? And so she always tells me, because like I'm not that tall, right? But I'm like way taller than all my siblings and my dad and everybody else. And so like I also look a little different. And they're like, and my parents got divorced and then were remarried. And so my mom passed away. So I don't want to make any aspersions about her, like, you know, behavior or whatever. I don't think this, but it is like an inside joke where my wife looks, she goes, how did that, when she points at me, come from that? She says that all the time. Because like, you know, my dad's a wild dude. My brother's crazy. Like, you know, just like I am obviously too, but like we're all completely different. Luckily we have like me and my siblings get along really well and like we're really close and everything else. But it's funny that you brought that up because my own wife was like, no, I don't believe this.
But it's true. You know, it's like it did not make me popular with all my team, but like I used to just proclaim before I learned to keep my fucking mouth shut that like my goal.
You got to teach me the way, man. You got to teach me. I get in so much trouble.
Like, so one of the things that I did learn about keeping, because listen, I will go on and like scream it from, like people would say to me when I was publishing What Works on Wall Street, don't you want to keep that secret? And I'm like, are you fucking crazy? I'm going to go on TV. I'm going to have the Wall Street. I'm going to give it to Barron's. I'm going to just shout from the rooftop and maybe someone will say, oh, what's this book all about? Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But my dream was always like, I want to be alive long enough so that I can have a company where I'm the only employee. And everything else is
right
tech.
Now. Yeah.
But everything else is tech. And you're going to be able to fucking do it. And I'm envious because the tech that's coming, dude, it's like you're going to be like a kid in a candy store. And this is what I love. Like the reason I love people with your mentality and like the all in, I'm very much of an all in kind of guy. Like I burn the ships. And like, I know that's
another common theme. And no, but that like, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I have to point this out to people listening is like the advice that you'll get from founders that have built successful companies, so much so that somebody wrote a book about, were so good at their job, somebody wrote a book about them. That's insane, right? And the advice you'll get from like average people, usually it's like directionally opposite, right? Where it's like, no, diversify or like have a backup plan. And then you have people like Jeff Bezos say plan B should be to make plan A work.
Exactly.
You have Larry Ellison saying, hey, I take the boat out of shore, I pick an enemy and I pick a fight and then I burn the boats. Like they put their back to the wall and force themselves to invent their way out of the problem. So I didn't interrupt, but like that is.
Yeah, no,
like,
that's
more common than not.
But you should interrupt because that's a point that people need to hear. Listen, guys, you know, none of this stuff, you said it earlier, problems are opportunities. And like to me, to you, to people who think like this, like so many people, I try to work with younger people, not just in my industry, but in a variety of industries to kind of help them in their personal development and like see what they should be working on and doing. And one of the things that I just like have the hardest time, and I get frustrated because I blame myself that I haven't been able to get through on these issues. But this idea that people are so afraid of risk, and they're so afraid of like, I'm going to fail and then I will be covered in shame, and like everyone will hate me, and my wife will be mad at me, or my husband will be mad at me, my kids will hate me. Are you crazy?
In a world that is constantly changing, the biggest risk is not taking any.
Totally. 100% true. And like, so I told you before we started recording about it, this friend of mine who's really smart. He's a doctor in Manhattan, but he's also an amazing investor. And like, I've had him on the podcast, and he's like, he was at my place, and he's like, Jim, I got a bone to pick with you. I'm like, sure. What? And he goes like, dude, like a lot of people listen to your podcast. And I'm like, I don't think so. And he goes, well, okay. The right people listen to your podcast. I'm like, okay. And he goes, but I'm beginning to hear people who like, I would be surprised to hear them quote you. And I'm like, okay, what do you mean? He goes, the line that you are really getting through with is, we are deterministic thinkers living in a probabilistic world. Hilarity or tragedy often ensue. And I'm like, what do you mean? I love that line. And he goes, dude, do you want to destroy our entire advantage? And I'm like, go on, Sid. And he goes, dude, like, we are risk takers, right? When risk is for sale, like, if you see that intelligent person, hire them, right?
Yeah.
If there's a reasonable risk for sale, people like me and Sid say, yeah, we'll buy that. And he goes, the only reason we can do that is because 95% of the population want to sell you that risk. And he's like, if he goes, that's because they're deterministic and they're terrified of what might happen. And he goes, imagine, if you will, Jim, that it's 50-50 or 49-51.
Yeah.
And he goes, there's no Elon Musks, there's no Steve Jobs, there's no Bezos, there's none of these people, because everybody is calibrated. There's no progress. Right. And then I start thinking about that, and I'm like, that's really a good point. And then you start thinking about previous societies, man. And there was no progress. Like literally you could live in a European country, right? Let's just pick England, right? So you could live in England between 1200 and 1600, and you don't notice anything that's different.
Tim Urban from Wait But Why has great posts about that, where it's like, how the hell, if you look at the graph he has on his blog, where it's like what you said, like 1,000 years, the line is flat. Then the Industrial Revolution in 1800 just goes complete. Is it parabolic? What is it when it goes straight up?
It's exponential.
Okay, boom, just straight up. This is something too where it goes back to the start of this discussion, is like, it's entrepreneurship, like an inherent thing, which I think me and you lean towards, where it's like you have a hard time relating to people that think like you, that think like you're describing, in the sense that like they're like, oh my god, like they look at the downside. Like when I was in college, Facebook was just taking off. We were all on MySpace, and the quote on my MySpace profile was, there is no security, only opportunity. Like, I've never believed in security because we're all going to die.
Yeah,
we're temporary beings. We have no idea how long we have, and we're like, okay, let's just sit here and like let's just ride this out. It's like, what are you doing? There's a great line. Let me see if I could. I just reread D Hawk, who just passed away, like 93 years old. He's the founder of
Visa, right? Yeah,
Visa.
I've read about him. Yep.
And he has one of the greatest lines. First of all, he's like a really, I don't know if I've ever come across anybody that thinks like him, but his description of what life is, and like, to me, the people that are obsessives like you and I, like, you have to be good. Like, you want to control your time and what you do for work, right? So that's why you found companies. That's why you start something new, whatever it is. But that's only like part of living a great life. And this description of what D Hawk came up, he's got beautiful language. What he described life as, he says, life is a magnificent, mysterious odyssey to be experienced. And I think the people that you're describing, where they're like scared of taking risks, or like they want to live in like this little like routine or bubble, like they're missing out on a huge part. It's like, it's an odyssey, it's an experience, and there's going to be great times and terrible times. And there's a guy I heard talk on a podcast one time. He does these crazy things where like he walked across Antarctica, and like he does like shit like that. It's like, oh yeah, like he rode the Drake Passage in a rowboat and like had to shit in a bucket like off the side of the. He's like, why are you doing this? And he said something that was beautiful. And I've listened to it over and over again because when I find these videos, I save and listen to them over and over again. And he's like, he quoted the Thoreau quote, like most men live lives of quiet desperation. It's one of the greatest quotes ever, right? And he says, what I'm scared of is living a life range bound between 4 and 6, which is most people do. It's like they don't take risks. They don't actually go after what. There's like, well, I'm fine doing this, but he goes, I'd rather live a life where I have a bunch of 1s and 10s, where it's like I have days when I'm on my 40th day of carrying my sled across Antarctica. It's a 1. Like I'm beat up, I'm frozen. I feel terrible. But when I get to the end of something that I took a big risk on, and whether it's a successful mission or not, that is a 10. He's like, the people that live range bound, that live in this like little bubble, they're so afraid of the 1s that they cut off the 10s, and you're cutting off a main part of life. It is a magnificent odyssey to be experienced. Stop being afraid of fucking life and live. Figure out what you want to do and go after it like your life depends on it, because it fucking does.
Preach, brother. Because like I put up, I do threads on Twitter instead of blog posts because I get like a 20x audience. And so it's like I put up one on this whole idea of why are we here, right? And you see a lot of the same thought ends up at the same place. It's what I call the bridge of nihilism, right? The people who really think about this shit, and like people as disparate as Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching and Socrates, all the way through, the poets and Shakespeare himself. Man, you want to read somebody who knows shit about humans, read Shakespeare.
Right.
But anyway, it's totally the blueprint. But the whole thing is, man, everybody gets to the same place, and which I call the bridge of nihilism, which is there is no meaning to life, none. And there's no like cosmic, this is the meaning, this is what you must do. But when you if you can walk across the bridge of nihilism, what happens when you get on the other side is you realize if there is no meaning to life, I get to determine the meaning in my life.
Yeah.
And then you start thinking like the way I think. It's like, I think of myself, I think I'm one of the luckiest people on the planet every fucking day because I beat the cosmic lottery, man. The fact that me and you are here having this conversation and are conscious and can think these thoughts and have these wonderful conversations with one another. Do you know what the odds against that are? Trillions
numbers larger than trillions and
against.
trillions. Yeah.
It's against. And here we are. And what else are we? Are the result. Every single person you see, or if you're driving, listening to this podcast, or if you're watching it on YouTube and somebody comes to your door, I don't care where you are, if you're in South Dakota or North Dakota or New York or London or Paris, any human you see is the results of millions of years of success. Think about it.
Yeah.
Their forefathers and ancestors managed to breed. They managed to live long enough to pass on their genetic code. Do you know how many people don't manage to do that? Like for much of history, the majority.
And then all the things that your ancestors had to get right, or the decisions they had to make for you to even exist. We started the conversations like, we're connected to the internet. Guess what? Who doesn't have the internet? There's no fucking podcast in Cuba. Like me and you, if my grandfather did not take that risk to jump to the United States, me and you are not having this conversation. I don't even know what the internet is. Who knows what kind of like mentality? Like I could not imagine my life without the internet. Like the amount of learning, 99% of the stuff I learned came after high school, after college, after all this. It came from the internet. Totally. And just that one decision by a person I never met. He died when I was like 3 or 4. So I don't really remember him. I met him, but like, you don't remember.
Sure.
But like that one decision changed the entire trajectory of my life. Like that is, and I always talk about this too, where, to some degree, I study dead people for a living. And it is one of the greatest things that has ever happened to me, because when I think, like, I'm constantly reminded about our eventual, like the eventual end of our life. And it's not a morbid thing. It's like what Steve Jobs said. He's like, listen, death is one of the greatest inventions of life, because in the face of death, everything else that's not important falls away. And so if you can have the reminder that, hey, I'm here for a short amount of time. It's an odyssey. The purpose of life to me is to experience it. And and entrepreneurs and founders in general, and these kind of people, like they get to build their own worlds within the world. And that's the way I think about building a company. It's like company building is world building. because you get to
Totally.
control on how you spend your time, who's around you. Like if you're really good at it, then essentially you get like a bunch of resources that most people don't have, and that opens up all kinds of unbelievable opportunities. And I'm not talking about like buying Ferraris and shit like that.
Right.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about freedom, the
Yes.
control of your time.
Yes.
And so like that is why it's just like, how could you not be obsessed with something like this? I've never met an entrepreneur that's good at what they do that is not obsessed about their work.
Exactly. And also your idea of memento mori. I think about that every day. Remember, you will die. And I don't think about it in a morbid way at all. I think about it like it reminds me to live. And it
Yes.
reminds me to like cherish every day. And I really mean that. It sounds goofy, but it's true. It's like I'm gonna die. And nobody, I guess most people don't want to die, but like I certainly don't want to die. I want to stay around for all the cool stuff. But that, I got born in 1960, and hopefully I'll make it as long as my grandparents did, or my dad, who didn't die until he was nearly 97. And like I've got the good genes, but I'm just so excited about everything that is going on right now that like I'm giddy. And like you mentioned earlier that like it seems that there are so few optimistic people. Like, dude, I am so optimistic about what is coming, what is here already. Listen, man, the Prometheans are among us right now. And wait until you see the creative innovations that they're already rolling out, and wait until you see what's coming next. Like I'm in a privileged position where I can meet and talk to these people and see with my own eyes, like, hey, check this out, dude. And you're just like, what? And it's just
the energy that you get from these people too. Like people can't, it sounds like some willy foo-foo shit. It is not. Like when you're around people that the most interesting people are the most interested. And
always.
Like in the position that you're in, where I heard you say on one of the podcasts where you're like, I'm extremely lucky because anybody I find interesting, I can have a conversation with them because I can invite them on my podcast and they'll come. And so you get to meet all these interesting people on the internet, and they're all inevitably obsessed with whatever their one vertical could be, right? But they can, as long as somebody's super interested in something, you don't have to share their enthusiasm for the subject. You're still going to be interested in it. And that energy is going to feed, like you're going to feed off of their energy. Because they wake up every day trying to build this thing they want the world to have. That's a special human.
It truly is. And I love that point because I'm like really lucky. I always like admittingly say I'm, basically a very lazy person. I say I'm a cognitive miser. but so like one of the kids who works for us talked me into starting this podcast. And I'm like, dude, like I'm not going to edit anything. And I'm like, and so I'm talking to Patrick about it, right? And he's like, okay, Dad, why are you doing this? And I said, honestly, and he goes, yeah. And he goes, I have an idea and I want to see if I'm right. And I said, okay, well, because I want to talk to people who are much smarter than me about things that I'm really interested in. And he goes, bam, I knew that was your reason. He goes, you'll do great. Just do it.
Yeah.
Because he goes, your reason is authentic. That's all you really want to do.
This goes back to the advice. Like, I feel like advice for founders and people who want to start something is you have to just listen to people that have that same gene or that same mindset, because this is what you hear. It's like, every time I come across somebody with an unusual brain, I tell them the same thing. You need to have a podcast. They're like, why? Like, because you have an unusual brain and you probably don't know how unusual your brain is. And once you start recording your thoughts and people all over the world can access it at a time convenient to them, they're going to tell you that you have an unusual brain, and that's going to open up all kinds of opportunities you cannot predict. And they say the same shit. Oh, I've heard that, it's too late. There's too many podcasts in the world. It's like, it's the opposite. It's like, we're in day one. Like even now where they're like, oh, I just saw this numbers, and I think I said this to Patrick, where, because this thing is like, oh, there's 3 million podcasts in the world. It's already too late. And then somebody does the number. If you figure out how many are still actively updated, you're at like 155,000, 200,000 or something.
Right.
Imagine going back to the beginning of the internet when there was only 200,000 blogs. I guarantee you people told the same shit. Wait,
sure.
You can't have your own website. There's already 200,000 of them.
That's bullshit.
Or go back on, there's already 200,000 books. Why do we need more books? Like no one would say that. That's absurd. And so like the people, like I get to talk to podcasters, right? Because of our like we're in this business, and every single one of them, I have not talked to one that wasn't like, this is the best thing I ever did, and I'm going to do it forever. You don't understand the power of a podcast until you have one. And like, once you have it, you're like, damn, I should have listened to these people that told me to start a podcast years ago.
Yeah,
It's amazing. It's an unbelievable technological revolution that so many people, because they think it's somewhat ubiquitous, because it's still only about 50% of the population in America that actually listens, right? Like they think it's somewhat ubiquitous because everybody knows the term now, that like it's saturated, and that's not the case at all.
No. And, David Bohm, the quantum physicist, he had a great line, which was along the lines of, if you really don't understand a subject, the best way to learn about it is to write a book about it. And like, literally, I love that quote because I've written 4 books. I feel the same way about writing. I've been writing, like, if you can't write out your thoughts, you don't know what you think. But also, it's like, it is woo sounding, but I found it to be really true. Like, literally, there is some kind of magic that happens when you take the thoughts and extract them from your brain and put them into reality on a piece of paper or whatever, or you speak them onto a podcast, right? You've capped Robert Anton Wilson, who's way before his time, contemporary of Bucky Fuller, who, by the way, was another guy Jobs adored.
I have a biography of him I'm reading eventually and turning it to
I finished.
He inspired a lot of people, including James Dyson, who's one of my entrepreneur heroes as well.
Yeah, I know his daughter, Esther. Yeah.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And anyway, one of the things that is absolutely true is this idea of like, oh, but there's already too many of that. One of the kids who works for the podcast told me this, and I haven't verified it yet, so it might be apocryphal, but I hope it's not because it's so perfect. He was telling me that, like, literally they found the first form of writing that wasn't just accounting, because that's how writing started, because for accounting, basically it was like I was trading cattle for lambs with you, and we needed a record, right? But here's the thing. But also here's the thing that he told me. He said the first form of writing that was not accounting based was found and it was in ancient Sumerian. And basically it translated as a young poet lamenting that all the good poems had already been written. I just loved that.
So something I repeat on the podcast all the time is that history doesn't repeat, human nature does. And you just see, like, it's like you could expose humans that don't know each other, lived in different places of the world, different times in history, worked in different industries, and they arrive at similar conclusions. Like, that to me is like, when I find stuff like that, it gets me so excited. Because it's like these people that reach, in both cases, like they reach the top of their profession, right? The tiniest percentage to get to the top of their profession ever lived. And they thought about their business the same way, even though the principle behind, it's like, I always say, it's like, I'm not trying to copy the what, I'm copying the how.
Yep.
That's the important part. It's like, I always look at like, what's the meaning behind what they're doing? Like, why are they doing that? Not exactly. When I just read about Sam Zell, which is the podcast that'll come out tonight, whenever I get it out today, I'm not going to go build, a $39 billion REIT or whatever, like he's known for doing. Right. But like, I can understand why he made the decisions in building his business that I can apply to the business of podcasting. Exactly. It's like ideas are tools. It's just like, just make sure you're pulling out when you need to hit a nail, pull out a hammer, not a screwdriver. Like have to, no one could tell you when to pull, like what the right tool is. Like, so collect these tools and then pull them out at the right time.
Everything ultimately is a tool. It's like, sometimes people look at me like I'm weird when I say money is a technology, right? And like, what do you mean money is a technology? And then like, I'll explain like, the different forms of things that we use to trade, why money became important, all of these things, why interest became what it was. Credit comes from the Latin credo, i.e., I believe you, right? Yeah. I trust you.
Yeah.
And like, the reason I think that like having this, what other people would say, well, that's just weird extra knowledge. No, it's not, man. It's the map to understanding what all of these great minds that we can read for free. I mean, I think it was Descartes who said, reading the great thoughts of people who went before you is to have a brilliant conversation with the brightest minds of history always. And like,
that's exactly how I think about it.
Me too.
Exactly how I think about it. Me too. I think I said earlier, it's like, I'm just having one-sided conversations with history's greatest entrepreneurs all day.
Exactly. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? It's the way I look at it. And it's kind of like, the other thing that I just am kind of amazed by is so for example, one of my taglines, that you just said it a moment ago, history never repeats, human nature always does. And like, that's one of my lines about the market. When people say, well, like, what's your strategy? And I say, look, Markets change microsecond by microsecond. Human nature barely budges millennia by millennia.
It's not going to. It's
It's
going to be the same 1,000 years from now.
Of course, all I do is arbitrage human nature. It is the last sustainable edge. But to arbitrage human nature, you've got to understand that you yourself are human. You yourself are running human OS. You're going to be just as fucking dumb as everyone else if you don't figure out the process that's going to help you not be dumb. Yeah. And sometimes that's tying yourself to the mast, like Odysseus, right? Because he wanted to hear the siren song.
He knew what was going to happen.
But he knew what was going to happen, right? And so it's like...
It's like Charlie Munger warning us, hey, the way a rich person goes broke is by ladies, liquor, and leverage.
Leverage, right.
It's just like, you're not the first person to make these mistakes. I mentioned the last sugar tycoon in Cuba, Julio Lobo. Same situation. Like, he was in the 1960s and 70s. He had a net worth equivalent of $5 billion today, right? His biography is really a cautionary tale because he kept levering himself up. He dies in his 80s living in an apartment in Spain that is paid for by his adult daughter. Imagine having $5 billion.
Amazing.
And he almost, the second or third time, he lost his fortune a bunch of time. The second or third time, he was in, I think he was in New York in the crash of 87. And he's about to jump out the window. And he somehow, I don't know if a friend pulls him back or his own inner monologue, but there was a chance that he didn't even get to 80 because he was like, oh, I fucked this up again. I'm going to jump out the window. I had this discussion one time. Me and Patrick talked for like an hour or two because I had there's an observation that I had, right? Which I know nothing about investing. I would be very happy if I have 100% of my family's net worth riding on founders, right? And so I was telling Patrick about the story that was really interesting about Jeff Bezos's reluctance to get into physical retail. And he made the point one time that was fucking brilliant. And he's like, retailing is an ancient industry. To your point, the use of written language is like accounting for the fact that we're trading something before the invention of money, right? And so Jeff knows this. Jeff's obviously fucking brilliant. And so he goes, I am not going to get involved in an ancient industry and expect to have an edge unless it has to be like 10x drastically different. And so the first time he agreed to let Amazon's resources be used to attack this ancient problem of physical retailing was the stores where you walk in, grab the stuff, and you walk out, right?
Amazon Go. Yep.
And there's variations of that idea where they used to when they were building this before it was in the prototypes before it was public, you would go and you could buy like fish and meat. And Jeff's like, our edge is you walk in, you walk out. There should be no lines. Now they're in line to talk to a butcher or, somebody selling fish. He's like, he's like, you lost your theme here. Remove this. And so me and Patrick had this conversation. I was like, listen, there's an investor that I think everybody should study. Her name was Hetty Green. Okay.
Oh, I know Hetty very well. The Witch of Wall Street. I've read about her endlessly.
So when we were having this conversation, and this goes back to, if you want to keep something secret, Edwin Land said, if you want to keep something secret, you shout it from the rooftops. And so I meet with all these investors. I'm like, why aren't you guys starting podcasts? Like, does anybody understand what Patrick's advantage he has? Not only does he get to talk to interesting people, he's got a giant audience. Those people want to invest in his fund, but also he brings distribution to any company that he wants to invest in. It's powerful. And I go, Patrick, what's really interesting about this is you're involved in an ancient industry. Humans have been investing since we've been alive, right?
Yep.
It just takes different forms. And I go, so I think about Hetty Green's interesting in the sense that she was so rich that she bailed. Think about this, being so richest woman on earth at the time. She bailed out New York City.
I know.
Yeah. So the history, but and she lived through how many they didn't call them depressions or recessions. They called them the better name, financial panics. That's the best word for it.
Of course.
Why did we change the name? That's exactly what it is.
It's totally insane.
She lived through 12 of them. And so my point that I was making is you at a fundamental level, you and Hetty Green are involved in the exact same trade. Right.
Yeah.
In her circumstance, her advantage was geographic. Right. She's set up in the financial capital, second financial capital world, depending on if he's out London or New York at the time. And she literally took a desk inside of, I think, Chemical Bank or whatever the name of the bank. And so her deal flow, right, her edge is physical. They know that she has a ton of money. And then every time these financial panics, there'd be a line at her desk of over-leveraged investors willing to sell her railroad bonds and all of the stuff she made money. And she made money in railroad bonds, real estate, that kind of stuff, and financial instruments. And so I go, but you wouldn't, if you're trying to say build that from scratch in the now 2020s, right? And you're still engaged in this very ancient craft and trade of investing, what would it look like? Right. And I go, it would look like what you're doing. Like you would start an educational podcast for entrepreneurs and investors, right? Where you guys can get together, share notes, essentially what we're doing. We're like, hey, this is some shit I figured out in building this company. This worked. It might work for you. Oh, I made that mistake. Avoid that mistake. All this other stuff. Here's an opportunity over here. You might want to pursue that kind of thing, right? And then, so you build this gigantic audience, right? Then you put it's super leveraged, has inherent leverage in the form of media, right? And then you put a giant fund that's like an old form of leverage on top of that, right? To kind of supercharge. So you have like two very drastic forms of leverage operating. It's like the Lollapalooza thing that Munger says in all his talks and writing. And I go, that's what you would do. But essentially, the important part of this entire discussion is like understanding that most of the craft and trade that we partake in are very ancient, right?
Oh yeah.
Like we were talking about AI generated art. That's interesting to me and you. We talked about it a lot, right? But humans creating art has been happening forever. This is just, if you did it today, you wouldn't say, hey, go to the art store. Unlikely you'd say, go to the art store, buy a canvas, buy some paint. You could still do that, of course. But in the future, it's going to be all AI generated, or at least it's going to wind up, dominating. There are still going to obviously be people creating art that way. But I just like that idea. It's like, oh, okay, what is the version of that? So my version of this is like, there's a great tweet I read one time where it's like newspapers were a fad, but the village storyteller is as old as language. And now podcasts are that version, except around the campfire, there's not, 10 people or 15 people. There's 6 billion.
No question.
But fundamentally, a podcast is storytelling. And that is, we talked about that earlier. It's like, that is the first way humans transmitted information. That is
Always.
Not, it is, me and you are engaged in an ancient art. We're just using the latest technology to do it.
Exactly. And to your point about AI art, actually, I take a different position than you do. I think there's going to be more human artists, not less, because I think that the tool that AI art gives the artist, right?
Oh, no, I agree with that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So I think you're going to see a massive burst in humans being creative as artists because they have these new tools, and all they do, like we've collected contemporary art for maybe 25 years. And there's a podcast with one of the sculptors in our collection that is really on this point. His name's Barry X. Ball, and he does exquisite work. He works in very unusual stones. And when you see his stuff, it's almost ethereal in its beauty, right? And we have a bust of his that is, it's one of our most commented on pieces when people see it. And so I'm listening to this podcast that my wife sent me of Barry, and like you'd think I'd heard like he's really temperamental and, the whole artist thing. But as I'm listening to the podcast, do you know what he's saying? He's talking about tools in art. And he's saying, he goes, I don't understand my fellow artists' fear of new tools. He's like, Bernini, one of the greatest sculptors in history, has got his own garden in Rome, right? Used every new technology. And then Barry goes on to say, his sculptures are impossible without the robotics and the software that he uses to help him shape that piece of art, right? And so, like, I get frustrated when I hear like people say, oh, it's going to take the artists away. It's going to take the poets away. No, man, it's going to give us a million new ones. And all we have here, it's like, if you're a visual artist, right? Would you get like really bent out of shape if I said to you, hey, I just invented a new color and I put it on your color wheel. Do you think you're going to use that color? The artist would look at it and say, fuck yeah, I got a new color. Are you kidding me? That's wonderful. Thank you. I love this opportunity. That's all AI is here. It's a tool. It's a tool that I have seen like really incredible graphic artists. I've actually watched them iterate on their own work, right? Using an AI tool. And the outcomes are so incredible because essentially it's almost like they're having a conversation with themselves in a way, because the AI is like it knows what they want it to do. It does it. And then they're like, no, I don't. Let's try it, And then all of a sudden, this graphic artist that I'm referencing, like he had 10 new images that he was going to be able to market. So I think I love the way you put it too, because so much of what we do is ancient, really, right? Like, we all got to eat. We all got to have houses. We all got to, these are all things we have to do. And all we're able to do, why you're able to build your killer business with Founders Podcast, is because the tools just got better.
100%.
And like before, and this is one of my huge themes with the Great Reshuffle, right? You don't like your neighborhood? Pretty hard unless you've got a lot of money to move, right? Or you need a job, or you need these things. You don't like your digital neighborhood? Very easy to move. Just do it. And like the things that I see, the ubiquity of the internet, Matt Clifford, somebody we've invested in through O'Shaughnessy Family Partners, and Patrick has invested in through Positive Sum, has this great example. He's on my podcast as well. And like literally I invested in his company because of my talk with him on the podcast. Like, oh man, this is your version.
Each other.
Yeah, it's also your version of, see this smart guy, hire him. Hi Matt, how do I give you money? Like now, I want to give you money right now. Yeah. And anyway, he's talking about the internet, and he's like, people don't understand. It is the greatest variance amplification invention in human history.
That's a great
And
line.
if you think about that for a minute, what happens, man, is time, space, geography all collapse. They're all gone. They're gone. So that means that I'm starting a new company after I retire out of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. It's called O'Shaughnessy Ventures. And one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to find all of these people who were unfindable 20 years ago. Because they're there. I always knew they were there, but how am I going to find the kid in Bangladesh who's a genius, who came up with this like really killer algorithm?
I can't believe you said that, because I just talked about this in the Sam Zell episode that I made yesterday. It's like, I met this guy through Twitter. It's mostly borrowed ideas on Twitter. He's very popular on Fin.
I know. Yeah.
And so I wound up talking to him. I met him. We've Zoomed before, and we've exchanged DMs. He DM'd me the other day because he's from Bangladesh. And he goes, David, he goes, your podcast is spreading all over the world because I went to go tell my Bangladeshi friends about it, and they've already been listening. And so one of the examples, one of my favorite examples that I ever had, and again, like I think podcasts in general are great businesses, and that's fantastic, but it's also like an obsession to me, right? But
sure, one
of the benefits is that like there's very few other businesses in the world where you have more of a connection with your quote unquote customer, because it's not really a customer, right? It's like a parasocial, like listener relationship. And so I get literally, I don't even know how many messages every day, right? Which is fascinating, because then just like, hey, like they'll hear like one line, and then their application of it, and like they'll tell you like, hey, I did this, or whatever the case is, right? And so back when it was, I've experimented with a bunch of different business models. Now, obviously, it's open, free for all, and ad based, and obviously connecting with Patrick was a big help in doing that. But back in the day, I would do like one free episode and then do a subscription for the next episode. So every other one was free, and that's how the business model was. And so I got an email from this guy. I'm pretty sure he's in Nigeria. I'm going to say his last name because I don't want to say his full name in case he doesn't want this out there. But his last name is Gondo. And it was the craziest email where he's just like, I've been listening to your episodes over and over again, and I was homeless. I was living in my car. And so he's like, I used what I learned from these stories. I started a company. I raised money from a venture capitalist, right, for this idea. And now, and I think it was like $10 a month. I forgot what it was, $10 a month, $99 a year, something like that. I changed venture prices, but he's like, I didn't have the money to access the other episodes, and now I do. And so like, and he knew that because like when you sign up, you get my email address. And so he emailed me and told me this. And I was like, this guy went from living in his car, taking ideas he heard on a podcast in fucking Africa, and starting a company, raising money. So I immediately refunded, and I go, here's a lifetime membership for free, bro. You're not paying me a goddamn thing. Like that email alone was way more valuable than you paying me $100 a year forever. Like that's fucking incredible. And so when you hear stories like this, the result is I got to get off my ass. I got to wake up in the morning and I got to get going, because I have no idea. It's completely unpredictable how people are going to be using what they're learning from the miracle. And think about the podcasting in general. It is a free tool, an open protocol that nobody owns. Like right. Imagine if it had to come from a company. Like that's insane. And it's permissionless. Like you could start a podcast right now, cost, $10, $15 a month on like a starter plan, or maybe even free on a podcast host. And it's in every single podcast directory in the world in 15 minutes. And then I recorded, people were like, oh, I get emails all the time. It's like, what kind of equipment you need to use and all this other stuff. I was like, I recorded my first 200 episodes with a $99 USB mic. It's like, it's not the fucking equipment, man. It's like, what is coming out of your mouth? What are you talking to people about? It's not the equipment. You could start a podcast for $100. Like, that's it.
Totally could not agree more. And the idea that you've taken, and is a timeless idea, in my opinion, is it's all comes down to action, your ability that the passion pulls you towards. And then if you can tell a good story, that's an asymmetric advantage. If you're a good storyteller, like, the world is a nicer place for you, because it really is. It's one of the, I believe you can, like Buffett himself, right? He went to Toastmasters because he was afraid to speak in public.
Yep.
And that's the only
What's the return on investment he got from that?
Oh, I mean, how do you even, like, infinite, right? Like,
and then let's say you wanted to start a podcast on books, right? I've spent thousands of dollars on books. Like, it is insane. You don't do that. Go to Project Gutenberg. There's literally thousands of books that are out, like, they're free, and you could read them and then make a podcast about them. We talked about philosophy, history, entrepreneurship, whatever the hell you're interested in. Like, do it.
So I had a friend who was kind of a pessimist by nature, and he's like, yeah, but I can't do that. And I just smiled, and he goes, you're going to tell me to do it on the internet, aren't you? And I went, I'm not going to name it. I said, friend, the internet is taking all of your excuses away from you. You don't have any excuses anymore.
There is a talk that I think is the best talk for entrepreneurs to listen to. It's by Bill Gurley from Benchmark. It's called Running Down a Dream. I won't shut the fuck up about this talk. And it's really a combination of all the themes that we've been talking about, the importance of passion, and then what you just said there is in that thing. Because his whole point was like, and I heard this, and it really, like, I was already doing the podcast, but it, like, made me, like, step up my game. Because he's like, first of all, he goes, if you're trying to compete he was giving a talk to MBA students at the University of Texas. And he goes, listen, you can't fake passion. He's like, no. If you act like you're passionate about something, you're going to compete against somebody that actually is. And he said his line is something like, and you're going to get smoked. That line was fantastic. Like, they're going to smoke you, or you're going to get smoked, which is 100%. But he goes, there is no excuse. He's like, this is not the same thing as being the smartest, right? He says there's no excuse to not be the most knowledgeable person in the world in any field that you choose, right? He goes, you can collect more information, and there's no excuses because now it's free and on the internet. And when I heard that, I'm like, okay, that's my fucking line. It's like, I will not allow anybody else on the planet to read more biographies of history's greatest entrepreneurs than me. That's a small niche. That's fine. I don't give a shit. It doesn't have to be a large niche, but no excuses. Like, it's as simple as picking up the book, reading it, thinking about what's actually taking place, taking notes and organizing information. And then presenting it to other people. And if I do that,
I got to interrupt you for a minute.
Yeah,
you're being too modest about yourself, because yes, you're right. Anybody can pick up a book. Yep. Anybody can read that book. Anybody can take notes from that book. However, it is an art form and a gift to have the ability to synthesize ideas in such a manner that you do on your podcast. Like I said at the opening of this, like, I don't listen to podcasts twice in a row. I just don't. Not my own, not my son's, not yours, nobody's. Yeah. I listened to your podcast twice in a row, dude. Yeah. Because, like, my wife came in and she was like, oh, you're really digging something, right? And I'm like, you gotta listen to this. And but the point is, I think that it's a skill that's partially innate. It can be learned through repetition, which you proved with your 300 books, but the ability to curate, the ability to synthesize knowledge the way you do, and the way that you tell a great story too, man. I mean, let's just be honest. And so what could be more entertaining than actually learning a lot of new things and be entertained at the same time? Are you kidding me? Like, to me, that's what education should be. I also think, like, being funny, like Lenny Bruce, the guy who, gave us George Carlin, right? I love him too, right?
I think stand-up comedy is one of the greatest art forms in the world. Like,
I agree.
They stand up there with just their mouth. Their brain and their mouth. Like Patrick's youngest sister, is a stand-up comedian.
and she's hysterical. Anyway, but my point was going to be that the ability to synthesize knowledge, present it in an enjoyable and fun way, and curate that knowledge, right? Like, so am I going to rely on myself when I'm trying to decide on the 12 different books of Edison? Or am I, now that I know you, going to text you and say, hey, David, which one, man? Give me the one Edison book. And this is all that connection thing, which you're talking about, Patrick, with the funnel on top and the leverage. Listen, one of the things that I'm obsessed with are networks. And what we have right now is our networks in earlier pre-internet days were just very physically confined, right? Unless you had a lot of money or whatever, you couldn't like go to a million different places, right? It was very difficult. You mentioned Hetty, the Witch of Wall Street. Like she had her edge. Her edge was she had money and she had physical location. But you've got to change your thinking in terms of network now, because my network is infinite. And like you're a node on it, and now you're going to be a bigger node on it because we know each other now and we're going to interact more. But the fact is, I can put a bunch of different nodes from all over the world on that network, and they can communicate and, you know, talk and bullshit with each other.
You just did this for me. So like Trung Fan, who I had known because I liked his threads and I listened to his podcast, not investment advice. He found my podcast because you were very enthusiastic about it, which I appreciate it. He starts listening. First, he starts following me on Twitter. Then he starts listening. Then he sends me a message that he's like working my way through, like, he's like been listening to a bunch of episodes. I'm like, bro, I fucking listen to your podcast. I was like, he's like, do you want to come on my podcast? So I'm going to go on his podcast. Then we went up having a 2-hour conversation because of you. You know what I mean? Like, fucking crazy. And now, literally this morning, we're texting about Francis Ford Coppola and Apocalypse Now, and like, because I did his biography, and then he just went on your podcast to talk about like the future of television and like all this other stuff. It's like, oh, there's a million different connections here. Like, this is fucking crazy.
And the cool thing about this network is, as you just outlined, in the past, we wouldn't know a 10th, not even 1/100th of the things that you just mentioned, the connections that got made, because we didn't have the opportunity to. Like, I think if I have any gift, I was born in 1960, so I remember what that world was like.
The analog world.
Like, the analog world, man. And the analog world fucking sucks, honestly.
For super driven, curious people like you and I.
Yeah.
This is my point. That you used the thing earlier. It's like trillions upon trillions. Like, we're just so unbelievably lucky not even to be conscious, but to be alive now. Do you want, like, that's fucking crazy. Imagine, what the hell would you and I be doing 100 years ago? And you talked about
perambulating. We'd be perambulating, walking like around.
The amount of lengths. So I read a bunch of biographies on Ben Franklin and Abraham Lincoln. They're both like personal heroes of mine. And like heroes. you go to the amount of length that they had to just get a book. They literally would have to fucking stay up all night long because generous people in their life would lend them a book, but you have to give it back to them. And they're reading by candlelight. And I just talked about this, and you talked about people's reaction to new technology. You know, people did not like the car. Like, they threw stuff at it. They said we had to make it outlawed. They had to make it illegal because it scares horses. And I made the point in the Henry Ford autobiography podcast I just did a couple of weeks ago. I was like, do you understand that picking up horse shit used to be a job?
Yeah.
That was like, your dad's job is, all right, I'll see you later, son. I got to go out the house at 5 a.m. I'll be back when it's dark, and I'll spend my day shoveling horse shit. We are unbelievably lucky. So that's why people are always like, oh, like, you're working 7 days a week. Are you worried you're going to like burn out? I'm like, no, because anybody that burns out lacks historical context. If you are able to make money in air condition looking at computers all day, you are luckier than 99.9999% of every human that ever fucking lived.
I even go further than that. If you are, every day I take a hot shower. And every day that I get into a hot shower, I just look at the universe. I'm not a religious person, but I just look at the universe and I say, thank you. I can't fucking believe how lucky I am that I get to have a hot shower and a clean body every day.
Yeah.
If you understand human history,
indoor plumbing.
Are you kidding me?
There's a great story in D Hawk. I mentioned D Hawk, the founder of Visa, who has been in my mind recently because I reread his autobiography again when he passed away as my own like small way to honor him, right? And he's been hugely influential, like the Collison brothers of Stripe. Like they talk about D Hawk and looking up to him all the time. So like that's what I think of, like the greatest thing about entrepreneurs is like when they get to 70, 80, 90 years old, they all write these autobiographies and they're like, hey, I had all these ideas. I know I'm towards the end. I'm going to push them down the generation. Like it's so fucking generous. But the funny thing that you just thought about that is like his mother taught him, like there's no indoor plumbing. He did not have indoor plumbing. So he was living in like the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And he would like, you had to run in the winter like 100 feet to the outhouse. And the lesson he learned when you're trying to, go to the bathroom in sub-zero degree weather is not to dawdle. And so that's his mother reframed that. She's like, oh, it'll teach you not to waste time. And it's like, that dude grew up like that and he started Visa. What excuse do you have?
Exactly. It's just like the internet has taken all your excuses away from you. If you refuse to learn, it's because you refuse. If you want to learn, I can give you a curriculum that will take you an entire year and will cost you zero. Your podcast is on it. Patrick's is on it. Some of mine are on it. A lot of reading on it. Lots of YouTube videos on it.
Go and read. You just said Shakespeare. Go read Shakespeare. Go read the books that have been around for 500 years, 1,000 years. They're free. They're free. I have a listener who started a podcast, and what he does is there's a lot of people that are interesting in history, right? And he does like 10-minute episodes, which I think is actually a good idea. And it's like, well, like they don't have biographies written about them, but they have like blog posts or they have Wikipedia pages. It's like, that's an interesting story. Why is somebody should do that? And he learned that idea from founders. He's like, I'm not going to read a book, but why don't I cover the people that don't have books?
So interesting that you say that because like I've mentioned O'Shaughnessy Ventures, we're doing several verticals only where we feel we have an asymmetric edge and where it's win-win. I'm just tired of this zero-sum game mentality. The internet is making it a win-win society that we're moving to. And I'm going to do everything I can to demonstrate that. For example, David Perel, I just underwrote 15 scholarships there. And that's the reason I did it because I'm greedy, man. I want access to those big brains. So the deal that I struck with David is 2 of those people are those who wish are going to be offered internships at O'Shaughnessy Ventures. And then, we're going to let them learn. We're going to learn from their learning, but then most importantly, we're going to plug them into our network. And like, what is my advantage, right? My advantage is I've been around, not my first rodeo. And you just I look at all of this talent, all this youthful talent, and not just youthful, by the way. There's some people who like decided they hated what they did and they just chucked it all at age 50. And they're kind of like trying to find something.
Talk about that. We got to talk about when you're done.
But the point is, like, what are they lacking? They're smart. They're eager. They're showing up. They're like, I love this Michael Jordan thing because I'm going to use it all the time now. Michael Jordan is always coming to you, man, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And as he pointed out, you missed me. You missed me. And so I don't worry about that. They're going to come. And to me, what can I do for them? I can give them money. I can give them structure. I can give them, here, learn all about this for me. And then do this report and or write this thing. We'll have them do a bunch as interns, but all of that time, they just get to learn. And then they get plugged into the network. And no doubt they've got a business idea. Maybe they got a book idea. I don't really care what it is. They've got an idea. And now that we have this limitless network, those people, those great talents will see us at O'Shaughnessy Ventures and they'll go, oh, I might want to check that out. But the reason I'm bringing it up is your idea about the 10-minute thing. So I've got a fun book here that's called Zanies. And I've looked for it online. It's like out of print. I haven't found it. I check for it occasionally. Anyway, it's about eccentrics throughout history. And I was talking to my team and I'm like, you know what we should do? Just like once a day on the website, one of us should narrate for 5 to 10 minutes one of these stories. Because I can almost guarantee you that nobody's heard of these people. And when I love this book, because as you read it, man, it's just like the shit people did. And it's just fascinating and it's fun. And like the way people used to, there was a guy, the Emperor Norton of San Francisco. And like he was like today we would say he was homeless or he was mentally challenged or whatever.
Yeah.
He declared himself emperor of the United States. And the citizens of San Francisco were so taken by this that they let the charade go. He issued his own currencies and he brokered pieces between neighborhoods and he got a state funeral when he died in San Francisco.
That's
All
hilarious.
the San Franciscan lined the streets on both sides. And like, just what a charming story. What a great story. And like, all I have to do is pull this book off the shelf. We'll pick one a day. We've got 365 days right there.
So I think about the medium of podcasting, obviously, all the time, right? And what I realized is like people think podcast is like a thing. It's like, It's got to be an hour-long interview show, and like, no, it's a medium. It can be whatever you want. And there is a gigantic hole in like my podcast. I like personally podcasts are about 60 to 90 minutes long, in general, like, and because you said the value is in the compression. Right. And I think if I'm going to do 4 or 5 hours, I'll just buy an audiobook, which has like been edited and scripted out.
Right.
Like that
Exactly.
To me, that makes the most sense. Right.
Yeah.
And so what I realized is like, we're all around that hour and a half, like time. And I was influenced. You brought up the importance of stand-up comedy. And like, I think we share a love of the art form. And like one of my favorite podcasts forever that's been around for like nonstop for almost 15 years, maybe 12 years is Bill Burr, a comedian, his Monday Morning Podcast. It's like, that's why when you listen to my podcast, it's just like, just me. There's like, no, like, it's just, what I wanted is like, what would it be like if you met up with your friend once a week who read a lot and he just told you the shit he learned that week? And it's like, that's how it is. That's why I speak directly to the audience. It's like no fluff, no other shit. That came from Bill Burr. Like that's literally what he does. And it's amazing that he could just do this with just his mind and his mouth. And he makes an hour long. I at least have a book to support me. He's going off life experience of, being a stand-up comic for 30 plus years or whatever the case is. I do want to like circle back around to one thing before I forget though. And that's this idea that you have to be young to do something, which has been the exact opposite experience that I have. I repeat this line on the podcast several times. Like, don't be surprised if your best idea comes 30 or 40 years into your career.
Totally.
And like you look at all the experiences you have as just preparing you for an opportunity you can't yet see. Like, even if even if you're working in the same industry. So like the famous example of that is Sam Walton, right? He was 44, 45 when he started Walmart. He had been working in different forms of retail and at this craft for 20, 25 years, right? Steve Jobs came up with his best product when he was close to death, the iPhone, right? He made great products in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? It was 40 years. And then he comes up with his greatest idea. Henry Singleton, which is a personal hero of mine.
Singleton is amazing.
He didn't start Teledyne. He was like 43. So that was his first company, right? Had all these experiences, obviously a genius too. So I'm not trying to compare myself to him, but he starts his first company at 43, runs off one of the greatest records in American business history for the next 20 years, and then just dips out and works on his ranch. Like, it's not, in many cases, I can't think of out of anybody I've ever read about besides Mark Zuckerberg, who is the outlier of outliers. They all had multiple times of failure before they found what they were good at. Most people were surprised. Walt Disney's first company went bankrupt, and the first company went bankrupt. David Ogilvy, who's a personal hero of mine, he didn't start in the advertising industry till he was like 35. Like, people have time. And like, that's the biggest thing I try to pull out. And like one of my favorite lesser known founders that I learned about through the process of researching for the podcast is Henry Leland. Henry Leland founded the first commercially successful American automobile company. That company was Cadillac. It was making $2 million a year in profit when he sold it to GM. Henry Leland was 60 when he founded Cadillac. He was 70. His hero was Abraham Lincoln. That's why Lincoln Motors is named Lincoln Motors. He was 70. He founded Lincoln Motors when he was 70.
Yep. And again, it brings us full circle to, and I can't believe it. I'm so happy I asked you for 3 hours because we are closing in, my friend. But it circles back to, that's another great example of all of your excuses are gone. I mean, we're living longer. So if Leland, back when the average death happened at age 65, by the way, that's why they picked age 65 to give Social Security, because you were dead. It's basically, congratulations, you fucker, you beat the actuarial tables. Nobody, I mean, if we were doing it today, they'd pick 85 or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that excuse is gone now too. And so, like, what I love about you and your message, it's so consistent with mine, is like, you are one of the luckiest creatures on this planet. And you, I'm talking about all of us.
Yes.
You are one of the luckiest creatures to ever exist in this universe. Just put it in that, instead of the opposite, I'm just a speck on the third rock from the sun. I mean nothing. Put it the other way around and say, the odds against me are trillions and trillions against. And yet here I am. So what are we going to do with that? What my advice is, if you want your life to have meaning, you got to give it meaning. You've got to find something you're passionate about, something you love, like you've done, and then just bring it home. Because your life, even like, you might not even succeed. You probably won't the first couple of times, as you well point out. I failed spectacularly with one of my companies. And like, it was just filled with learning opportunities rather than anything else. So listen, I think you go.
I think a piece of advice that I've realized from studying the life stories of so many people is like, a great life is just a string of great days. So the first step is finding out how to have a great day, and then put another day next to it. And so the way I do that is, like, my personal hero, I got my blueprint from this guy named Ed Thorpe, who's obviously an extremely famous investor.
Of course. Yeah. No.
And out of every single person that I've studied, like, he's the only one that you didn't over optimize for his professional life at the detriment to his health and his personal life. Right. And so what I realized is, like, what did he focus on? He focused on his health. He focused on a business that he thought was, like, intellectually stimulating. He could build wealth at. So he built wealth. He had fun. He spent time with his with his kids and his wife. And so that, when I looked at it, it's like, he just gave me a blueprint for a great day. So then my life is a balance of, I focus on my work, spend time with my family, take care of my health, to have some fun, because we're alive, goddammit. Yeah. And then I do the same thing every day. And so if I do that, I've now organized my life and I have complete control over, like, I have more autonomy than most people do. Granted, of course, that was by design. But if I do that today and I do it the next day and I do it, I'll get to the end of my life. Like, that was a great life.
Yeah. I listen, and I agree. I admire Ed Thorpe greatly. I think he's right. I think it's a good blueprint to use. I try to do basically the same thing. I'm lucky that I live, like Patrick and Lauren live right 5 minutes from me, and I see my grandkids all the time. And like, that's as big a part of my life as the business part. Now, there are times, like when I'm starting a new thing like I am now, it takes a lot of time and effort and everything else, but they still show up, and I still go play with them.
Yeah, yesterday was a perfect example where I was working. And it's funny because right now there's this hurricane coming. So we have, instead of a snow day, they have hurricane days. And so I woke up, I worked out, I was working on the podcast for a while. And then it got to lunchtime where I was like, okay, well, my daughter has to do a science project. So I was like, it was my wife, our son, and our daughter. I was like, let's go to lunch. And then let's go to, like, I took basically like a 2-hour break in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And so, like, we had lunch, we got all the stuff you needed. And then I came back home and I went back to work. Like, it's a balance. It's that work-life harmony. Like,
harmony. I love. And that's your term, and I prefer that.
It's Bezos' term.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. All right. I am at the end of my time here. I gotta have you on again. I hope I can get you to agree.
Anytime you want.
All right. Because this has been more fun, actually, than I even thought it would be. And man, my expectations were super high, as you know, because I asked for 3 hours. So I end my podcast differently than Patrick. That little sneak, he got the really good question. But he did name the podcast after my first book as an homage. So
which I just found out recently. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was very nice. His other contender for the title was "This Is Your Competition," which I thought was pretty good too.
That is good.
Anyway,
I think he named an episode that with, I think, Josh Wolf.
Yeah.
I saw that.
So what I'm doing is I'm waving a wand. I'm giving you a magic microphone, and you get to speak 2 commands into it that will incept every human on the planet. They're going to wake up the next day. You can't kill anyone. You can't do anything bad, but you are going to incept 2 ideas in all of humanity. They're going to wake up the next morning thinking it was their idea, not yours, and they're going to act on it. What 2 things are you going to incept?
I'm only going to do one, and pick the right heroes.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
I think human beings, whether we want to believe it or not, it's like we're constantly copying and emulating the people around us. You have to be very careful. There's a line I took from a rap song where it said, "The mind is a powerful place. What you feed it affects you in a powerful way." And so regardless, like we assimilate and copy everything around us. And so I think picking the right heroes is one of the most important things you can do. And a lot of that is like this discovery process I've gone through. I now have a better understanding by studying almost 300 lives of other people of like what's important to me and who I am as a person. And so it's a lot of this is like, oh, I don't like that behavior or I like that. And so like over time, I've been able to pick the right heroes. And I think that'll change the trajectory of your life.
We're ending it there, my friend. This has been more rewarding, more fun than I thought. I'm going to have you back on. I'm going to hold you to that. And now you've joined the Colossus Network, so your show is free. It comes out once a week.
Yep.
And I cannot more highly recommend a podcast than this one, listeners and viewers. It's amazing. David does an amazing job, and you're going to learn so much. But at the same time, you're going to be really entertained. And I love that combination. All right, my friend. Cheers.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jim. And I'm super happy we got connected.
Me too. Cheers.
All right.